Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where curiosity gets comfortable and science settles in for the evening. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that would be at once thrilling, inconvenient, expensive, scientifically priceless, and just a little bit terrifying. Because for this quiet journey, we're asking a question that sounds like it escaped from a museum gift shop, a late-night documentary, and a public safety briefing all at the same time. What if Tyrannosaurus rex was still alive today? Now, that is not a small question. It is the sort of question that arrives with very large feet, a very large mouth, and absolutely no respect for property lines. It also has a way of waking up the imagination almost immediately. A living T-Rex is one of those creatures people think they already understand, right up until they try to picture it standing somewhere modern and specific. Not in a jungle from a film, not in a thunderstorm behind dramatic music, not in some conveniently abandoned valley where only reckless billionaires and confused scientists happen to wander. No, picture it somewhere real, somewhere current, somewhere ordinary. A T-Rex crossing a road at dusk. A T-Rex moving through the edge of a pine forest. A T-Rex seen on a grainy traffic camera at 5:42 in the morning while somebody is on their way to buy coffee and mind their own business. It changes the feeling of the animal straight away, doesn't it? It stops being a fossil and becomes a neighbour, a very bad neighbour perhaps, but a neighbour all the same. Before we wander too far into this modern world of dinosaurs, let me gently ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your corner of the world right now? There is something oddly fitting about that, I think. A video about a creature from deep time, and here we are scattered across time zones, meeting in this one small hour to imagine what it would mean if prehistory had never quite finished packing up and leaving. If you find this soothing, interesting, or simply a pleasant way to wind down after a long day, I would be very grateful if you left a like, maybe subscribed, and stayed with me a little while longer. It helps this quiet little place reach others who might enjoy drifting off to questions that are slightly too large for daytime conversation. And if this one keeps you awake for a bit, well, at least you will be awake in a world that still has dinosaurs in it, and that does make losing a little sleep feel somewhat more understandable. So, settle in, let your shoulders drop, let the day step back a pace or two. We are not in a hurry. There is no need to sprint when the thing we're discussing would almost certainly catch us anyway. Let us just take it slowly and see where the idea leads. The strange thing about Tyrannosaurus rex is that it has never really left us. Not completely. Its bones sit in museums.
Its name appears in children's books, research papers, toys, games, and films. Its skull is so familiar that even people with no interest in paleontology can recognize it at once. Few animals, living or extinct, have such a strong hold on the public imagination. The lion may still rule the savanna, and the shark may still glide through the sea. But T-Rex occupies a very special place in the human mind. It is the giant predator by which we measure giant predators. It is less an extinct animal in popular culture than a permanent category of power, appetite, and scale. And yet, for all that fame, most of us hold a version of T-Rex in our heads that is oddly frozen. It lives in a warm, prehistoric swamp of assumption. It roars, it chases, it bites, it vanishes back into the fog. We rarely stop to ask what would happen if it had to exist, not as a symbol, but as an actual animal with actual needs. Where would it sleep? What would it hunt? How much ground would it require? How often would people run into trouble with it? What would a government agency even call the department tasked with tracking a 15-meter carnivore through mixed woodland and agricultural land? One imagines the paperwork would be exhausting, because that is the shift this question demands. The moment we ask what if T-Rex were still alive today, we stop treating it as a dramatic idea and start treating it as biology. And biology is always a little more complicated than mythology.
Real animals do not exist for cinematic entrances. They need territory, water, energy, prey, shelter, breeding space, and a workable balance with the rest of the ecosystem. Even the most fearsome predator is, in the end, an organism trying to survive in a world full of limits. That is where the question becomes much more interesting. If T-Rex were alive today, it would not simply be a monster dropped into the present for our entertainment. It would be part of the modern natural world. It would compete, disrupt, adapt, fail in some places and perhaps thrive in others. It would force people to change laws, roads, farming practices, wildlife policy, emergency planning, tourism, and no doubt insurance language. It would reshape the way we think about wilderness itself. Because right now, even in places with lions, bears, crocodiles or tigers, most people still move through the modern world with a quiet assumption that truly enormous land predators are rare, distant, and in many places absent. A living T-Rex would put an end to that assumption with remarkable efficiency. Imagine how quickly ordinary language would change. Children would learn dinosaur safety with the same seriousness used now for fire drills and road crossings. Hikers would check regional alerts before entering forested areas. Farmers would secure livestock on a scale that makes ordinary fencing look decorative. News broadcasters would deliver updates in that very particular tone they use when trying to sound calm about something that is clearly not calm at all. There would be maps, warning signs, tracking collars, restricted zones, satellite monitoring, an endless debate over who is responsible when a 30-foot predator decides that a motorway verge looks like an excellent place to stand and think. And yet, for all the obvious danger, people would not only fear it, they would admire it. That part is unavoidable. Humans are very consistent in this way. We are frightened by large predators, but we are also fascinated by them. We turn them into emblems, mascots, logos, national treasures, conservation icons, and the subject of expensive documentaries narrated in a slightly hushed voice. If T-Rex were alive, there would be arguments certainly. There would be panic in some places and outrage in others, but there would also be wonder. Deep, sincere, almost childlike wonder. Because however practical the problems became, however many barriers had to be built and rules written and satellite tags fitted, there would still remain the astonishing fact that a creature we associate with vanished worlds was here, breathing the same air, leaving fresh tracks in mud instead of ancient ones in stone. That thought has a peculiar effect on the mind. It compresses time. The gap between the Cretaceous and the present suddenly feels less like an impossibly vast absence, and more like a door left slightly ajar. Dinosaurs stop being a closed chapter in Earth's history and become unfinished business. Of course, the moment we picture T-Rex alive in the modern age, another issue appears. Not the dramatic one first, but the practical one. Where exactly would it fit? The modern world is already crowded, wild spaces are fragmented, roads cut through migration routes, cities spread, farms expand, forests shrink. Even living species that evolved alongside modern ecosystems struggle to find room. Elephants clash with villages, tigers move through human edges, bears raid bins. Wolves wander into ranchland. Now enlarge the predator, enlarge the appetite, enlarge the public response, and place all of that into the same crowded century. It is immediately clear that a living T-Rex would not simply test our courage. It would test our ability to coexist with something bigger than our infrastructure was designed to handle. And that, I think, is why this question remains so compelling. It is not only about the dinosaur, it is also about us. About how modern humans respond when the world refuses to stay neat and scale to our convenience. We have grown used to being the uncontested managers of the landscape. We build roads where we like, plant fields where we choose, fence what we own, map what we need, and assume that very large dangers are either under control or safely fictional. A living T-Rex would challenge that confidence in an instant. It would remind us that nature does not become less real just because we prefer it curated. There is also a tendency, when thinking about extinct predators, to imagine only chaos. People running, vehicles flipping, fences collapsing, dramatic music doing most of the heavy lifting. But real life is usually stranger and more detailed than panic alone. There would be agencies formed, experts consulted, legal definitions argued over for years, and committees assembled to decide whether a certain wetland counts as essential tyrannosaur habitat. There would be local rumours, blurry footage, overpriced guided tours, black market eggs if eggs existed to be stolen, and a truly exhausting number of people attempting to take selfies from distances best described as career-limiting. Scientists, meanwhile, would lose their minds in the most respectable way possible. Because think what it would mean. A creature known mostly from fossilised bones would become available for direct study. Movement, coloration, growth rate, muscle distribution, reproduction, social behaviour, vocalization, disease, metabolism, hunting style, sleep patterns, parenting, if any, lifespan, territorial range, healing, skin texture.
Bite force measured not through inference alone, but through living tissue, pressure sensors, scans, and observation. Entire academic debates that have lasted decades would suddenly move from careful speculation to active fieldwork. There would be paleontologists standing very still in remote blinds with notebooks, trying to remain professional while witnessing the biological equivalent of history walking past. And naturally, the first few years would be full of surprise, because real animals are rarely as simple as their legends. Perhaps T-Rex would prove more patient than expected, perhaps more observant, perhaps less prone to pointless aggression and more prone to conserving energy, as many large predators do. Perhaps it would spend more time scavenging than people like to imagine. Perhaps its voice would be lower, stranger, and less theatrical than the roaring version popularized by film. Perhaps its feathers, if present, or patches of display structures, if present, would make it look at times more complicated and even more unsettling than the stripped-down reptilian image most people expect. A living animal always resists the neatness of the version we invented in advance. That is part of the pleasure of asking these questions slowly. The image becomes less cartoonish and more real with every step. The giant skull is still there, yes. The huge jaws, the ground-shaking size. But around those dramatic features comes detail, a pace of movement, a pattern of feeding,
A limit to endurance, a need for water, a sensitivity to weather, an interaction with parasites, bacteria, wounds, age, hunger, heat, and the dull everyday business of staying alive. Once you allow T-Rex to become a real modern animal instead of a symbol, the world around it sharpens too. A forest path no longer feels like a generic backdrop. It feels like part of a hunting range. A livestock field becomes a possible food source, or at least a temptation. Riverbanks become crossing points. Industrial outskirts become barriers. Freight lines become risks. National borders become meaningless to the animal and very meaningful to the people arguing about whose problem it currently is. And through all of this, we would keep trying to reduce it to something manageable. That is one of our habits as a species. We name, measure, classify, fence, insure, regulate, and reassure. We would want population estimates, risk categories, official protocols, safe viewing distances, approved deterrents, capture strategies, tranquilizer studies. We would want to know whether one T-Rex is more dangerous in drought conditions than in wet seasons. We would want a number for how many calories it needs each week, and a chart for how often it moves through settled land. We would build apps, alerts, databases, guidelines, and no doubt several disappointing educational mascots. But underneath all that organisation would remain the basic fact that a tyrannosaur is a tyrannosaur.
However much science clarified, however many procedures existed, There would still be moments when the modern world met something very old on terms that did not entirely belong to us. A line of stopped cars on a country road, silence in the tree line, a shape too large to make immediate sense. Then recognition, spreading through the body before the mind has fully caught up. That is the heartbeat of this whole idea. Not just danger, not just spectacle, recognition. Recognition that the earth was once built to hold animals on this scale, and that if even one of them had remained with us into the present, our cities, habits, and assumptions would have formed around that fact from the very beginning. We would tell different stories, build different fences, teach different lessons, respect distance differently, perhaps even think differently about our place among other animals. So as we move further into this world, let us set aside the easy version of the question, the one that only wants noise and panic, and look instead at the animal itself. Because before we can understand how a living T-Rex would affect modern society, we need to picture it clearly as a living creature, not a skeleton in a dramatic pose, not a movie monster timed to leap out at the convenient moment.
A breathing, moving, flesh and blood predator built by evolution, carrying immense weight on powerful legs, balancing itself with that long, heavy tail, sensing, choosing, conserving energy, and making its way through the world according to instincts that would be ancient even by our standards. And once you begin to imagine that properly, the next question arrives almost on its own. If Tyrannosaurus rex was still alive today, what kind of animal would we actually be dealing with when it stepped out of the trees and into the light? If a living Tyrannosaurus rex stood in front of us today, the first surprise would be how quickly it stopped feeling like a movie creature and started feeling like an animal. A very large animal, certainly. A deeply impractical animal. An animal that would make every sensible person take 2 firm steps backward and reconsider their life choices. But still, an animal. That matters, because the real version would not move through the world like a villain waiting for dramatic music. It would breathe, watch, pause, conserve energy, test the air, and behave like something built by evolution rather than a script meeting a deadline. In terms of sheer size, an adult T-Rex would be difficult to process at first glance. Current museum summaries and research-based reconstructions commonly put large adults at roughly 12 to 13 feet high at the hip, up to about 43 feet long and around 6 to 9 tons in mass, with a skull close to 5 feet long. That means a living individual would not simply look tall, it would look deep, heavy, and solid, with the kind of volume that makes nearby objects suddenly seem like scale models. A road barrier would look flimsy, a small tree would look negotiable, a family car would look like something that should not be left unattended near it. The overall body plan would likely feel more balanced and more controlled than the older popular image of a tail-dragging reptile.
Its torso would sit forward over massive hind limbs, with the tail stretched out behind as a counterweight. The neck would not be swan-like or dainty. It would be thick and workmanlike, built to support a very large head rather than wave it about theatrically. And the head itself would dominate your attention, not only because it was enormous, but because it was functional in a very specific way. This was a skull built to seize, crush, and process bone-rich carcasses with exceptional force, not just nip at prey and roar into storms for effect. Then there is the matter of what it would be covered in, which is where expectations begin to wobble. Based on published skin impressions from T-Rex and close tyrannosaurid relatives, there is good evidence for scaly skin over at least parts of the body, and no direct published evidence yet showing a fully fluffy adult T-Rex. That does not settle every detail forever. Paleontologists still leave room for uncertainty about limited filamentous coverings in some body regions or life stages. But if you are imagining a giant feathery puffball from nose to tail, the present evidence does not strongly support that. A living adult would most likely appear predominantly scaly, though perhaps with patches or structures that still look more bird-like than the older crocodile-only image suggests. In other words, it would probably disappoint both extremes equally, which is often a sign that science is doing its job properly.
Its skin texture would matter more than people think. Scales on a creature that large would not read from a distance as neat little tiles. They would affect how light sat on the body, how mud dried on the legs, how scars showed, and how age changed the surface of the animal. A fresh young adult might look tighter skinned and more athletic. A mature individual could look rougher, heavier, more creased around the neck and flanks, and generally like something that had been having serious discussions with the environment for many years. It would not be polished. It would not be smooth. It would look used. Colour is one of those things people desperately want a definite answer on, and paleontology still cannot hand them one with confidence. So if T-Rex were alive today, one of the first shocks would simply be seeing its real colours. Whatever those turned out to be, they were almost certainly not chosen for our convenience. Large modern predators tend to carry colours that help with camouflage, signalling, heat management, or species recognition. So a living T-Rex might not be a bright green lizard at all. It may have been mottled, muted, countershaded, patchy, or marked in ways that broke up its outline in scrub, woodland, river edges, or floodplain vegetation. The most unsettling possibility is not that it would look fantastical, but that it would look ordinary enough to disappear until it moved. Movement is another place where the real animal likely differed from its most popular versions. Current biomechanical work does not support the idea of an adult T-Rex as a high-speed sprinter charging around at racing car velocity. A 2021 study estimating preferred walking speed placed that natural pace at about 1.28 meters per second, or roughly 4.6 kilometers per hour, and a 2017 biomechanics study argued that T-Rex was unlikely to run at all in the usual sense, because the stresses on the skeleton at very high speed would have been too great. Other estimates for top speed vary, but the general modern picture is far less unstoppable sprinter and far more huge, efficient walker with limited acceleration compared with smaller theropods. That does not make it slow in any comforting way. An animal can be terrifying without behaving like an oversized greyhound. In fact, a deliberate predator is often more unnerving than a frantic one. A living adult T-Rex would probably move with a measured gait most of the time, placing each foot carefully, letting momentum do part of the work and avoiding wasted effort. Its size alone would give that walk tremendous presence. You would feel the motion through the ground, yes, but more importantly, you would notice how little of it seemed wasted. There is something much more alarming about an animal that does not need to hurry, and when it did need to close distance, it would likely do so in bursts, not endless chasing.
Not dramatic marathon pursuit, just enough power, timed well. Large predators often rely on timing, positioning, surprise, and force rather than cinematic amounts of running. Given the current speed research, the real danger of T-Rex would probably not be that it could chase a Jeep for miles. The danger would be that it might not have to. If it chose its moment well, if it used cover, terrain, wind, or low light, it might only need a short, decisive approach. That is a much less flashy hunting style, but a much more believable one. Its senses would have been a major part of that. Museum and anatomical work suggests T-Rex had large forward-facing eyes, strong binocular vision, and unusually developed olfactory regions, pointing to excellent depth perception and a very keen sense of smell. Research on the brain case and ear region also suggests Tyrannosaurs were adapted for low-frequency hearing. Put all that together, and you do not get a clumsy brute. You get an animal that could likely detect scent across large areas, judge distance well, and pick up low sounds better than high chirps or squeaks. That would make it effective not only in open ground, but potentially in dawn, dusk, or cluttered habitat where information comes in pieces. The eyes in particular deserve more respect than they usually get. The popular image of T-Rex often centers on its teeth, but the visual system matters just as much.
The American Museum of Natural History notes that the eyes were large, forward-facing, and set relatively high on the head, supporting depth perception and long-distance viewing. That suggests the animal was not just built to bite whatever stumbled in front of it. It was built to assess range and target position with some precision. A living T-Rex would not give the impression of a creature simply crashing into opportunities. It would look like it was calculating. That is not a comforting thought, but it is a useful one. As for the famous bite, this is the part where the real animal becomes even less reasonable. A 2017 scientific report study estimated maximum adult bite forces in the range of roughly 18,000 to 34,500 newtons, with tooth pressure sufficient to puncture and fracture bone. The same work supports the idea that T-Rex was capable of what researchers call osteophagy, meaning bone-crushing feeding. In plain terms, it was not just taking meat off a carcass. It could process the harder parts too. So if a living T-Rex fed in the modern world, it would likely sound less like a neat bite, and more like a violent demolition project being undertaken by a creature with no concern for noise complaints. That feeding style also tells us something about behaviour. T-Rex was almost certainly not a picky eater in the way popular imagination sometimes prefers. Fossil evidence supports both active predation and carcass use. A PNAS paper reported a T-Rex tooth embedded in a hadrosaur tail vertebra surrounded by healed bone, which means the prey survived the bite long enough for the wound to heal. That is direct evidence of predatory attack, not mere scavenging after death. At the same time, bite marks and bone processing show tyrannosaurs also made full use of carcasses when available. So a living T-Rex today would likely hunt when it had the chance, scavenge when it made sense, and avoid the human habit of insisting those two categories must be emotionally exclusive. Real predators are often more practical than romantic. Its day-to-day temperament would probably be less frenzied than people expect. Large predators do not spend every waking hour in dramatic confrontation. They rest, patrol, feed, drink, watch, and conserve energy. Much of animal behaviour is frankly administration. If T-Rex were alive now, a lot of field observations would probably consist of it standing, walking, pausing, or lying down in ways that initially disappointed people who expected constant action. Then, after enough study, we would begin to understand that this was exactly what a very large predator should do. Activity would come in short windows. The rest would be quiet competence. The arms would still look absurd at first, and this is where human expectations would betray her again. Because small on a T-Rex is relative. Those forelimbs were short compared with the rest of the body, but they were not decorative. They were robustly built, muscular, and ended in two substantial claws. We still debate exactly how they were used, and several hypotheses remain in play. But the important thing for a living encounter is this: you would not laugh at them for long. Once attached to a real moving animal, they would stop looking comical and start looking specialised, which is not the same thing at all. Their compactness might even make the whole front end look more unsettling, because all your attention would go straight to the skull. Social behaviour is where the picture gets less certain, and honesty matters here. There is some evidence that tyrannosaurs may not always have been solitary. Trackways from British Columbia show multiple tyrannosaurids moving in the same direction at the same time, and the AMNH has pointed to fossils of tyrannosaurs from different ages found together as suggestive of at least some degree of social grouping. But suggestive is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It does not prove that adult T-Rex lived in stable packs the way wolves do, or that they cooperatively hunted in highly organised teams. It means the old image of the eternal lone hunter is not the only possibility. A living T-Rex today might be mostly solitary, loosely social at times, family-based in some life stages, or socially flexible depending on food and season. That uncertainty would be one of the first major things field biologists would want to resolve. That point about age is especially important because T-Rex may have changed a great deal as it matured. New 2026 research in PeerJ, summarised by Eureka Alert, suggests T-Rex may have taken closer to 40 years to reach full size, longer than earlier estimates of around 25 years. If that holds up, then the species had an extended subadult phase, which could mean younger tyrannosaurs occupied somewhat different ecological roles from the biggest adults. In a modern setting, that would matter enormously. A half-grown tyrannosaur would not simply be a smaller copy of the adult. It might move differently, hunt differently, take different risks, and come into conflict with humans in different ways. Juveniles and adults might almost feel like separate management problems, which is exactly the sort of sentence that would make wildlife departments sigh heavily into their coffee. If we were lucky enough, or perhaps unlucky enough, to hear one, the sound might also surprise us. Because the exact vocalization of T-Rex is unknown, any reconstruction is necessarily cautious. Still, the evidence for low-frequency hearing in tyrannosaurs makes it reasonable to infer that at least some important sounds may have occupied a lower register than the classic film roar. A living T-Rex might have produced deep booms, rumbles, resonant calls, or short explosive sounds that carried through the ground and air in ways more felt than heard.
That is speculation, yes, but it is grounded speculation, and honestly, it is much worse than a roar. A roar is theatrical. A low rumble you feel before you place it is administrative. It suggests the animal is already somewhere in the area and is not especially interested in improving your comfort. All of this adds up to a version of T-Rex that is, in some ways, more impressive than the simpler monster version. Not because it becomes friendlier, quite the opposite. It becomes plausible. A plausible T-Rex is not just a huge mouth with legs. It is a mature apex predator with good sensory equipment, a bone-crushing bite, measured movement, uncertain but potentially flexible social behavior, and a body plan that was better tuned to walking, watching, and decisive force than to reckless speed. It would not spend its life trying to impress us. It would spend it doing what successful animals do, which is survive efficiently and without apology. And that is the version we need to keep in mind as we move further into this world. Because once you stop picturing a movie creature and start picturing a real one, the next problem becomes obvious. An animal like that cannot live just anywhere. It would need enough room, enough prey, enough cover, enough water, and enough distance from human habits to remain what it is. Which means the next thing to consider is not merely how T-Rex looked or moved, but where, in the modern world, a creature built like that could actually live at all.
If Tyrannosaurus rex were still alive today, it would not be able to live just anywhere we fancied placing it on a map. That is one of the first corrections the modern mind would have to make. We are used to treating famous animals as symbols first and organisms second. We put them on posters, flags, sports logos, cereal boxes and museum walls, and then, if there is time, we remember that they need food, water, shelter, breeding space, and a tolerable level of disturbance. A living T-Rex would not care in the slightest about its brand value. It would need a landscape that could support a giant predator day after day, season after season, year after year, without collapsing into constant conflict or simple starvation. That rules out a surprising number of places immediately. Not because the dinosaur would fail to impress there, but because being impressive is not the same thing as being ecologically viable. A city would not be habitat. A suburb would not be habitat. A fenced reserve the size of a large zoo would not be habitat. A few dramatic cliffs and a gift shop would not be habitat. The animal might appear in such places, accidentally or disastrously, but it could not truly live there in the full biological sense. To do that, it would need room, and lots of it. Modern large carnivores tend to occur at low densities, move over large ranges, and are especially sensitive to fragmentation, urbanization, and prey loss. That is true for animals far smaller than T, Rex, so for a predator of Tyrannosaur scale, the need for extensive connected landscapes would only become more demanding. The best place to start is with the world T-Rex actually came from. Fossils of T-Rex are strongly associated with the Hell Creek Formation, and comparable formations such as Lance, in what is now Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. Those deposits record the last part of the Cretaceous in a terrestrial setting shaped by floodplains, forested soils, lakes, and rivers, with a warm, moist subtropical climate and a shallow inland sea not too far away. In other words, T-Rex did not evolve in a barren desert of bare rock and theatrical thunder. It lived in productive, water-linked lowlands with vegetation, prey, mud, seasonal change, and plenty of ecological complexity. That matters, because if we want to imagine where it could survive now, the most sensible starting point is not the movie swamp or the open savanna alone, but a rich mosaic of woodland, river corridors, wetlands, and open areas large enough to support herds of big herbivores. So the modern habitat of a surviving T-Rex would probably not be one single kind of landscape. It would be a network of connected landscape types, open ground for visibility and movement, tree cover for shade, ambush, and shelter from heat, reliable fresh water, broad corridors for travel, large prey populations spread out rather than packed into one neat and unrealistic pasture. That combination is important because apex predators often use multiple habitat types rather than one fixed postcard setting. They move according to prey, water, breeding, competition, season, and risk. A living tyrannosaur would almost certainly do the same. It might spend part of its time on river flats, another part in forest edge, and another in more open country where large herbivores were easiest to monitor. What it would need most is not one scenic habitat, but enough intact country to let it choose among several. That makes river systems especially important. If you had to build a modern landscape for T-Rex from scratch, and thankfully no one has asked us to do that yet, you would begin with water. Rivers create life in a very practical way. They shape movement routes, support vegetation, concentrate prey, offer drinking access, and often create a patchwork of cover and open space. The Hell Creek world included rivers, lakes, and floodplains, and it is hard to imagine a healthy modern tyrannosaur population without something similar. A giant predator could not sensibly base its life in country, where every drink was uncertain, and every dry season turned survival into a gamble. It would do far better in broad lowlands where water remained part of the landscape, rather than an occasional surprise. For that reason, the modern version of suitable tyrannosaur country would likely look less like empty wilderness and more like productive, messy, living terrain. Not tidy parkland, not thin alpine forest, not sterile scrub stretching without prey. Think instead of large river basins, forested floodplains, wet woodland, open woodland stitched together with marsh and meadow, and lowland country where herbivores could gather in numbers worth hunting. A T-Rex could potentially cross dry ground, certainly, but thriving is different from passing through. Real success would likely come in places where plants grew well, prey remained abundant, and the terrain did not force the animal into long, wasteful journeys between meals. Dense tropical forest might sound attractive at first because it is lush and full of life, but it would bring problems too. A very large predator does not benefit from moving through heavy cover if every step becomes awkward and every line of sight shrinks to almost nothing. T-Rex was a huge, forward-moving animal with a long tail and a very large head. It was not built like a cat slipping between trunks in silence. It would probably do better in mixed habitats than in pure dense jungle. Forest edge, broadleaf woodland, wet clearings, riparian belts, and open patches would likely suit it better than endless thick growth. There is a reason many large predators today use ecotones, those useful transition zones where one habitat meets another. That is where cover, prey access, and visibility often come together in a workable balance. A living T-Rex would probably appreciate that balance very much. Open plains on their own would also be less ideal than people assume. They make for splendid distant photography, of course. Nothing says deeply questionable field location quite like a giant predator crossing open grassland at sunrise. But a plain without substantial cover, water structure or habitat variation would be limiting. Large predators do not just need somewhere to stand dramatically. They need a prey base that stays with them through the year, places to rest, movement routes that do not leave them exposed at all times, and often some way to avoid constant heat load. A tyrannosaur in endless open land might manage in some seasons, but a mixed landscape would almost certainly be more forgiving. Then there is climate. The fossil evidence places T-Rex in a world that was warmer and wetter than the dry badlands where many of its bones are found now. That does not mean the animal could only tolerate hot subtropical conditions forever, but it does suggest that warm temperate to subtropical lowlands would be the easiest fit for its inherited design. A surviving T-Rex might adapt across a range of climates over evolutionary time, especially if its lineage had millions more years to shift with changing continents and ecosystems. But if we imagine the animal arriving more or less as we know it would probably do best in environments that were not too cold, not too dry, and not too topographically awkward. Snowbound mountains, high elevations, and heavily frozen landscapes would likely be poor candidates for a stable core range. River-fed lowlands and productive warm temperate systems make more sense. There is also the question of prey, which quietly controls almost everything. However impressive the habitat may look to us, a giant predator does not survive on scenery. Large carnivores are highly vulnerable to prey depletion, and many require extensive habitat precisely because their food base is dispersed and often migratory or sensitive to human pressures. If modern tyrannosaurs existed, their usable range would contract very quickly. Anywhere large herbivores were too rare, too heavily fenced, too fragmented, or too intensively managed for them to access without immediately meeting people, roads, and firearms. Suitable T-Rex habitat would therefore have to overlap with landscapes capable of supporting many large-bodied prey animals at sustainable levels. No prey, no tyrannosaur, however beautiful the view might be. That one point changes the map more than anything else. A place may have woods, rivers, and weather that look acceptable, but if it lacks a dense enough base of large herbivores, it is not real tyrannosaur country. This would probably steer the species away from many modern landscapes that seem wild on paper, but are biologically too thin. It would also push it toward regions where large ungulates or analogous prey remained abundant across very large areas, and because those prey populations would also have to tolerate a giant predator, the entire ecosystem would have to be built around that reality. Herd behaviour would change, migration routes might change, watering sites would become high-risk areas, human land use would change too, whether we liked it or not. That brings us to the awkward modern problem. Suitable habitat for an apex predator is not only about what the predator likes, it is also about what humans will tolerate. Human-wildlife conflict is becoming more frequent and serious as human populations grow and habitat is lost, and large carnivores are especially difficult because they range widely and can come into direct conflict with livestock, infrastructure, and local communities. Even in Europe and North America, where wolves and bears have returned to some human-dominated landscapes, management remains complicated and often politically exhausting. Now enlarge the animal several times over and place it in the same conversation. A living T-Rex could survive near human landscapes in the narrow physical sense, perhaps moving mostly at night, or using river corridors and cover to reduce contact, but long-term persistence would depend on whether people allowed it to remain alive after the first expensive and memorable incidents. So the best modern habitats would not merely be ecologically rich, they would also be politically and geographically spacious. That means very large protected areas, buffer zones, low road density, and enough connective land between core habitats that animals could disperse without constantly crossing into towns industrial zones, or tightly packed farmland. Roads are a serious problem for apex predators even now, because large ranges and movement needs increased exposure to mortality and fragmentation. A tyrannosaur would not be immune to that. It might be big enough to survive a collision that would ruin several smaller species, but that is hardly a conservation plan. Roads would slice up movement routes, increase contact points with people, and create exactly the kind of repeated high-profile encounters that tend to end badly for wildlife. In practical terms, this means the most successful T-Rex landscapes in the modern world would probably be those that combine three things at once. First, a large prey base. Second, continuous, or at least well-connected habitat. Third, comparatively low human pressure. Remove any one of those and the whole arrangement starts to wobble. Plenty of prey but too many roads and settlements, and conflict rises. Plenty of space but not enough prey, and the animals roam too widely or decline. Good climate and cover but constant persecution, and the species retreats, fragments, or vanishes. This is not unique to dinosaurs. It is how large carnivores behave now, and there is no reason to imagine a giant theropod would be magically exempt from the basic arithmetic of survival. A further complication is that tyrannosaur habitat would likely not be static. It would change with age and size. Younger individuals might use denser cover, narrower corridors or different prey zones than full adults. Subadults may range farther into marginal country, taking smaller prey or more risks. Adults, being heavier and more dominant, might prefer the best access to water and major prey routes. That would make the range of T-Rex less like a neat shape on a map and more like overlapping layers, with nursery areas, travel corridors, feeding grounds, and exclusion zones around dominant adults. Wildlife managers already deal with complicated age and sex structure in living carnivores. With tyrannosaurs, the paperwork alone might become carnivorous. It is also worth saying that T-Rex would almost certainly become an edge specialist in the broad sense, even if not in the narrow technical one. Not an urban edge specialist, to be clear. No one needs that sentence to become real, but a user of boundaries between habitat types. River edge, forest edge, marsh edge, meadow edge, the edge between open ground and cover, the edge between where prey feeds and where a predator waits. These boundaries are often rich in opportunity, and a large visually oriented predator with strong scenting ability would likely make good use of them. It would not need the deepest wilderness at every moment. It would need the right mix of concealment, access, and prey predictability. Some people would argue that if it were truly adaptable, it could live almost anywhere from temperate woodland to semi-open ranch country. There is some sense in that. Apex predators can be behaviourally flexible. Some even persist in surprisingly human-modified landscapes when prey remains available and persecution is managed. But there is a difference between persistence and thriving. A species can haunt the margins of a world that does not suit it and still be under constant pressure. For T-Rex to really flourish, not just survive in low numbers and bad headlines, it would need landscapes designed or at least preserved with its ecological scale in mind. And modern humanity is not especially famous for leaving room for giant carnivores simply because they seem scientifically valuable. That may be the strangest part of imagining a living T-Rex. The problem is not only whether the dinosaur could survive the habitat, it is whether the habitat could survive us long enough for the dinosaur to use it properly. We have reduced, cut, fenced and roaded so much of the planet that even ordinary large carnivores struggle to move as their biology intended. A tyrannosaur would expose that limitation at once. It would need room on a scale that reveals how small and interrupted much of our so-called wild land really is. Still, if such land existed, and in some places enough of it might, the picture becomes much clearer. The best tyrannosaur country in the present day would be broad, productive lowlands with reliable water, mixed vegetation, open sight lines broken by cover, abundant large prey, low human density, and enough connected space to let a giant predator remain mostly a giant predator rather than a permanent emergency. Not a city park, not a theatrical island, not a fenced attraction with branded snacks. A real landscape big enough to ignore us for long stretches of time, and once you place the animal there properly, another issue begins to loom. Because a suitable habitat is only the stage, it is not the budget. A creature that large would need an enormous amount of food, whether by hunting, scavenging, or taking advantage of whatever modern ecosystems and modern mistakes put in front of it. So after finding where T-Rex could live, the next practical question is the one farmers, wildlife biologists, and every large herbivore in the area would ask almost immediately. What exactly would it eat, and how often would it need to do that? That question becomes serious very quickly, because feeding a giant predator is not just a matter of appetite. It is a matter of physics, timing, prey density, competition, risk, and plain old arithmetic. A living Tyrannosaurus rex would not simply need a lot of food in the vague dramatic sense. It would need enough food, often enough, in places where the effort of finding it did not cost more energy than the meal returned. That is the quiet rule behind every large carnivore on Earth. However fearsome the hunter looks, it still has to make the numbers work. And when the hunter weighs several tons and carries a skull like a mobile demolition device, those numbers become rather less forgiving. The first thing to say is that T-Rex almost certainly would not eat in the fussy, tidy way people sometimes imagine. It was built for force, not refinement. A 2017 study in Scientific Reports estimated adult bite forces in the range of roughly 8,500 to 34,500 newtons, with tooth pressures high enough to puncture and crack bone. That matters because it means this animal was not restricted to soft tissue. It could process a carcass very thoroughly, breaking into areas that many predators leave behind. A living T-Rex in the modern world would therefore make use of food in a blunt and efficient way. Muscle, connective tissue, organs, ribs, limb bones, and whatever else it could crush would all be on the table, if one can call the ground a table and a half-eaten carcass dinnerware. That feeding style tells us something important straight away. It suggests that Tyrannosaurus was not dependent on catching perfect prey every time. Bone-crushing predators are often better able to use the full value of a meal, and that gives them flexibility. A carcass is not just a strip of meat to them, it is a larger package of calories, minerals and marrow. In practical terms, this means a living T-Rex could likely feed as both hunter and scavenger, taking fresh kills when available and making excellent use of dead animals when it found them. That idea is not a retreat from the image of a predator, it is a more realistic version of one. Many successful carnivores do both, because nature is not sentimental about job descriptions. There is direct fossil evidence that Tyrannosaurus did hunt. A 2013 PNAS paper reported a T-Rex tooth lodged in a hadrosaur tail vertebra, surrounded by healed bone. The hadrosaur survived long enough for the injury to begin healing, which means the bite happened during life rather than after death. That is about as useful a clue as paleontology could ask for. It tells us that Tyrannosaurus was not merely wandering the Cretaceous landscape waiting for things to die politely in front of it. It attacked living prey. At the same time, bite marks on carcasses and the bone-crushing design of the skull and teeth strongly support scavenging as part of the picture too. So, in a modern ecosystem, T-Rex would likely behave much as practical large predators do now. It would kill when it could, scavenge when it made sense, and waste very little time on debates humans found emotionally satisfying. This has an immediate consequence for any modern landscape trying to support it. The prey base would have to be enormous, not just one healthy herd here and there, but a broad, sustained supply of large-bodied animals across a very large range. Apex predators generally occur at low densities and occupy large home ranges because the biomass they depend on is spread out. That challenge already applies to lions, tigers, wolves, bears, and other modern carnivores. Scale the predator up dramatically, and the pressure on the prey community grows with it. A living T-Rex could not thrive in a countryside where large herbivores were scarce, fenced into tiny parcels, or already struggling under human land use. It would need a landscape that could afford to lose large amounts of animal mass without collapsing. So what would actually be on the menu today? In a world where T-Rex survived naturally into the present, the answer would depend on geography, but the pattern would be clear. It would target the biggest prey that could be taken with an acceptable level of risk. Not necessarily the largest individual in sight, because that is a fine way to get kicked, crushed, gored, or otherwise removed from the breeding population. Modern large carnivores usually favour the old, the young, the sick, the injured, the isolated and the inattentive. There is every reason to think a living T-Rex would follow the same basic rule. It may have been huge, but huge predators are not foolish by default. They conserve themselves. A broken leg is bad enough for a wolf. For a tyrannosaur, it would be the sort of career setback one does not come back from. In North American conditions, which are the most obvious starting point for T-Rex, it would likely go after large ungulates and any other big herbivores sharing its range. In a reimagined present, bison-sized or larger prey would be especially valuable, and in a world that had evolved with tyrannosaurs still present, some herbivore groups might themselves have ended up much larger or much more behaviourally defensive than the animals we know. But even if we keep the prey modern for the sake of the thought experiment, the broad picture remains. Deer would be possible food, but inefficient for a fully grown adult unless taken easily or in quantity over time. Elk, moose, bison, feral cattle, horses, and any similarly large-bodied animals would offer much better returns. The bigger the predator, the less sensible it becomes to spend all day chasing what amounts to a snack. This is where the problem of feeding one alive becomes much more awkward than people first assume. A single spectacular feeding event on television can distort our sense of what a predator's life is really like. Viewers see one attack and think the animal must be constantly hungry, in a very dramatic, hourly kind of way. But large predators often live through cycles of scarcity and abundance. They may eat heavily when they can, then spend long intervals resting, digesting, and moving with caution until the next worthwhile opportunity appears. T-Rex, with its powerful jaws and ability to break down bone, was probably especially well suited to this feast and famine rhythm. A modern adult might not need to kill every day, but when it did feed, it could likely make a very serious event of it. Exact calorie estimates remain uncertain because dinosaur metabolism is still debated, with studies arguing for energetics that were not simply mammal-like or reptile-like. That uncertainty means any tidy daily menu would be false precision. Still, whatever exact metabolic category it occupied, a multi-ton predator would impose a very large demand on local prey over time. That uncertainty about metabolism is actually more important than it sounds. If T-Rex ran on an energy budget closer to a highly active mammal, it would need food more regularly and in greater quantity. If it operated with somewhat lower ongoing costs, as some mesothermy arguments imply, it could stretch meals farther and endure longer gaps. Either way though, no one should picture a giant carnivore casually sustaining itself on the ecological equivalent of a sandwich and a little optimism. Even the lower estimate still points to a species that would place heavy pressure on large prey communities. The argument is over how heavy, not over whether it mattered. And once an animal's food problem becomes large enough, it quickly becomes everyone else's problem too. Another thing we would learn very quickly is that age matters. Juvenile and subadult tyrannosaurs were not just miniature adults with worse judgment. Fossil work on a young tyrannosaurid, Gorgosaurus, published in Science Advances in 2023, found stomach contents showing the youngster had eaten the hind limbs of two small bird-like dinosaurs. Separate work in Piaget has described feeding traces attributable to juvenile T-Rex, supporting the idea of ontogenetic dietary shifts, meaning the diet changed as the animals grew. That makes excellent biological sense. Young tyrannosaurs were lighter, relatively faster, and less able to dominate the very biggest prey or carcasses. So in a modern world with living tyrannosaurs, the species would not place one single kind of feeding pressure on the ecosystem. Smaller individuals might take quicker, more agile prey, raid nests, exploit carcasses differently, or move into edge habitats more often than the full adults. A wildlife manager trying to predict what T Rex eats would therefore be making the same mistake as someone asking what cats eat, without distinguishing between kittens and lions. That age structure would also make the species harder to live alongside. Adults might focus on the largest food rewards, but subadults could be the real troublemakers. Many medium-large predators get into conflict with humans not because they are the biggest individuals, but because they are the hungry, dispersing, still learning ones. A teenage tyrannosaur, so to speak, would be large enough to be catastrophic and young enough to be curious, opportunistic, and perhaps more willing to sample livestock, unsecured waste, roadkill, or poorly protected captive animals. In ecological terms, those in-between age classes might be the most flexible feeders. In public relations terms, they would be a complete nightmare. Scavenging would make matters even more complicated. A living T-Rex would not need to do all its killing personally to be ecologically dominant. Carcasses from disease, weather, accidents, river crossings, winter stress, and the work of other predators would all become opportunities. Bone-crushing jaws make scavenging especially profitable, because what is useless to one species may still be valuable to another. And in places where humans already generate accidental food sources, such as livestock losses, road collisions, and waste from large animal operations, tyrannosaurs would almost certainly notice. Large carnivores are very good at noticing. If a dead animal lay in an accessible pasture or on the edge of a transport corridor, a T-Rex would not decline the invitation out of professional pride. It would simply arrive, feed, and leave the local authorities with paperwork that would need a very large stapler. Once that starts happening, livestock conflict becomes unavoidable. If a living T-Rex ranged anywhere near ranches or farming zones, domestic animals would be easier targets than wild prey in many cases. They would often be enclosed, predictable, slower to flee, and concentrated in useful numbers. This is already a major issue with living carnivores much smaller than a tyrannosaur. Human-wildlife conflict rises wherever large predators overlap with livestock, and the economic losses can drive intense backlash. Scale that up to an animal capable of taking very large stock and breaking through ordinary assumptions about fencing, and you would not just have occasional losses. You would have a new category of agricultural planning. Farmers would not ask whether tyrannosaurs were present in the region. They would ask how recently one had been detected, whether breeding activity had increased nearby, and whether insurance now covered severe theropod interference, which sounds absurd until the premium arrives. There is another uncomfortable possibility too. Tyrannosaurs may have fed on their own kind when the opportunity arose. A 2010 +1 paper documented tooth-marked T-Rex bones interpreted as feeding traces, suggesting cannibalism. That does not necessarily mean packs of tyrannosaurs were constantly settling disagreements by eating each other, though one can imagine some meetings ending badly. More likely, it means a dead tyrannosaur was still a food source, and an opportunistic giant predator was not going to turn that down simply because the carcass had familiar proportions. In a modern population, that would have consequences for disease transmission, territory behaviour, and carcass management. It would also mean that every tyrannosaur death in the wild could become a temporary feeding hotspot for other tyrannosaurs, which is not the sort of location one would want appearing near a hiking trail. All of this points to a feeding strategy that is practical rather than theatrical. T-Rex would likely hunt when the odds were good, scavenge whenever it could, consume carcasses very thoroughly, and shift diet with age. It would probably avoid wasting effort on long, flashy pursuits, unless the payoff was exceptional. It would likely prefer situations in which size, timing, and bite force could do most of the work. Picture less of a non-stop chase scene, and more of a patient accountant with teeth, waiting for a worthwhile investment to wander into range. That, I suspect, is closer to the truth, and somehow less comforting. The prey, naturally, would not stand still for this arrangement. In a world with living tyrannosaurs, herbivores would behave differently because they had to. Group size, vigilance, migration timing, calving locations, and use of open versus wooded ground would all be shaped by the risk of tyrannosaur attack. Watering sites would be tense, forest edges would be checked carefully. Mothers with young would avoid certain corridors at certain times. Even animals too large for routine predation would react to the possibility of harassment, injury, or attacks on juveniles. A predator this big does not just remove bodies from the landscape, it changes the schedule of everything else living in it. And once prey behaviour shifts, human behaviour follows. Ranchers move calving grounds. Park managers close sections of trail. Road crews clear animal remains faster. Hunters complain that game patterns have changed. Tourism companies try to market safe viewing opportunities, which is exactly the sort of phrase one reads just before things become less safe than advertised. In short, feeding ecology becomes social policy. That is what happens when the appetite of one species is large enough to reorganize the habits of all the others. There is also the plain issue of numbers. However efficient a T-Rex might be, the land could only support so many. Large carnivores generally occur at low densities because the prey base limits them. A healthy population of tyrannosaurs would therefore likely be sparse over huge areas rather than clustered conveniently for observation. That sounds reassuring until you remember what sparse means in practical terms. It means the animals would be rare enough to be difficult to monitor, but common enough that the people who did meet one would remember it very clearly. You would not live in a world swarming with T-Rex. You would live in a world where enough existed to keep everyone alert. This would create a strange split in public perception. In places far from tyrannosaur range, people would talk about them in the cheerful way people discuss impressive wildlife they never have to lock a gate against. They would argue online about whether T-Rex was primarily a predator or a scavenger, whether it preferred one habitat over another, and whether it could theoretically outrun an SUV, which is exactly the wrong question to need answered experimentally. But in regions where the animals actually lived, the conversation would be much more practical. People would discuss carcass response times, herd vulnerability, seasonal prey movements, and whether that low rumbling sound across the valley meant a kill site nearby, or just a very unfortunate drainage pipe. The more one looks at it, the clearer the problem becomes. Feeding a giant predator is not solved once the predator finds food. It is solved only when the ecosystem, and the human society around it, can absorb the consequences of that feeding. Can the prey population sustain it? Can the landscape remain connected enough for hunting and scavenging to happen away from constant human collision? Can people tolerate losses, delays, restrictions and uncertainty? Can livestock be protected at meaningful scale? Can carcasses be managed before they attract more attention than anyone wanted? These are not glamorous questions, but they are the ones that determine whether a giant predator remains part of the living world or becomes a permanent emergency with excellent teeth. And that is why food, more than fear, would decide the modern fate of T-Rex. Not whether it looked frightening in the headlights, not whether it sounded dramatic in documentaries, not whether it inspired a fresh run of highly profitable dinosaur merchandise. The real test would be whether enough calories move through the landscape, in the right form and in the right places, to keep such an animal alive without pushing every nearby human community into open revolt. A tyrannosaur might be able to live with hunger for stretches. Humans, on the whole, are much less graceful about inconvenience, which leads naturally to the next problem, because once a predator this large starts moving through the same world as roads, farms, fences, cameras, suburbs, and people who firmly believe they are at the top of the decision-making chain, feeding is no longer just a matter of ecology, it becomes a matter of encounter. And the moment modern humans begin meeting Tyrannosaurus rex face to face, or fence to snout, the balance between fascination and self-preservation becomes a lot more difficult to ignore. The first human meeting with a living Tyrannosaurus rex would not feel like a scene from a film, at least not to the people actually present. It would feel slower at first, more uncertain, and then much worse. That is one of the strange truths about encounters with large predators. The public imagination tends to fill them with screaming, running, and dramatic orchestral assistance, but real encounters often begin with confusion, a shape seen where no such shape should be, birds going quiet, livestock staring in one direction, a sound that does not fit the landscape. Then recognition arrives all at once, and recognition is usually the moment the body understands the problem before language catches up. With T-Rex, that delay would be especially brutal, because the brain has no modern file for a land predator of that size. It would take a second to believe the eyes, and that second would feel expensive. The reason this matters is simple. Fear starts before thought does, and with large carnivores, human behaviour in those first moments often shapes what happens next. What would follow socially is almost as predictable as what would follow biologically. People would be terrified, yes, but they would also be fascinated in exactly the same breath. A recent global review of human attitudes toward carnivores notes that these animals have long inspired fear, hatred, and fascination together, not separately. That mix is one of the constants of our species. We fear predators because they can kill us, and we are drawn to predators because they are powerful, watchful, and difficult to ignore. A living T-Rex would magnify that pattern beyond anything we currently know. There would be panic in some communities, denial in others, and a very determined class of people convinced they personally could read its body language from a suspiciously unsafe distance. There would be overnight experts, poor quality footage, expensive guided tours, and governments urging calm in voices that strongly suggested calm had already left the building. In short, the Tyrannosaur would become both a conservation question and a cultural obsession within days. The first places to feel this most sharply would be the communities nearest its range. That is another pattern we already know from modern large carnivores. People living closest to the animals often carry the greatest practical costs, while people living far away enjoy the romance at a safer emotional temperature. The IUCN's guidance on human-wildlife conflict stresses that conflicts affect safety, livelihoods, and well-being, and that coexistence depends not only on ecology, but on social tolerance, trust, and workable mitigation. In a world with T-Rex, that would become obvious at once. The city person 3,000 kilometers away might call it a miracle of nature. The farmer finding a broken fence at dawn would choose stronger language. Both reactions would be understandable, and because local tolerance matters so much for whether large predators survive in shared landscapes, the first years of human tyrannosaur contact would be as much about politics, compensation, emergency response, and public trust as about the animal itself. That means the first rules of survival would not begin with heroics, they would begin with distance. Modern guidance around bears and other large carnivores is remarkably consistent on this point. Do not approach, do not crowd, do not treat a wild predator as a photo opportunity. The European Commission's summary of large carnivore safety notes that approaching large carnivores is not recommended, especially where they may have young, and emphasises the value of information, waste management, carcass disposal, intervention teams, and clear protocols. In a tyrannosaur landscape, all of that logic would apply with even more force. The safest encounter with T-Rex would be the one that never became an encounter at all. You would want wide exclusion distances, road closures the moment an animal entered a corridor, and very little tolerance for people wandering off marked routes to prove a point no one asked them to prove. The first survival rule then would be simple enough to fit on a sign and serious enough to shape daily life. Stay well away. The second rule would be even less glamorous. Do not run. This feels wrong to the human body, which loves running away from large problems on principle, but predator safety guidance repeatedly warns against it. The US National Park Service advises people encountering bears not to run or make sudden movements, because those reactions can provoke pursuit or be read in the wrong way. Tiger conflict guidance similarly warns that running may trigger a chase response. We do not have a government pamphlet yet titled "What to Do When Tyrannosaurus Notices You," which is perhaps for the best, but the inference is not difficult. A visually capable, movement-sensitive apex predator with strong depth perception and predatory instincts is not the sort of creature one should encourage with panicked sprinting. That would not mean standing casually as though waiting for a bus. It would mean controlled retreat, distance creation, barriers, vehicles, structures, terrain, and every possible obstacle between yourself and the animal without turning the scene into a pursuit queue. Group behaviour would matter too. Modern bear guidance notes that groups are often noisier, more noticeable, and more intimidating to large animals than solitary people. That does not mean a T-Rex would be impressed in any emotional sense by 6 hikers sharing one bad decision, but it does mean isolated individuals would likely be at greater risk than organised groups. Human beings are poor prey substitutes when they are clustered, alert, and hard to separate. The same is true across many predator-prey systems. So, in regions with T-Rex presence, ordinary outdoor behaviour would change very quickly. Solo hiking would become less common. Children would not wander ahead. Camps would be structured differently. Trail systems might require check-ins, escorts, or vehicle-only access during certain seasons. A walk in Tyrannosaur country would begin to resemble a controlled activity rather than casual recreation, not because people had become dramatic, but because the landscape had become honest. Sightings near homes or roads would create another kind of tension, because modern people are very good at assuming that anything visible is somehow manageable. This is not usually true. Large carnivore safety literature emphasises habituation as a major problem. If wild animals lose their caution around people, food, infrastructure, or vehicles, conflict tends to rise. The European Commission notes the importance of proper waste management and carcass disposal, and the National Park Service warns against allowing bears access to food because it encourages problem behaviour. Scale that logic upward, and the lesson becomes immediate. In a world with T-Rex, nothing edible would be left unsecured in its range if people could help it. Livestock carcasses would need rapid removal. Refuse systems would be redesigned. Roadkill management would become urgent. Tourist feeding would be treated not as stupidity, though it would certainly still be stupidity, but as a public safety offence of the highest order. The first communities to understand this would probably survive more peacefully than the ones that did not. Vehicles would offer some protection, but they would also create false confidence. Safari cultures around living large predators already show how quickly people confuse "not immediately attacked" with "fully safe." Most of the time, large carnivores do not waste energy attacking enclosed vehicles, especially if the vehicle behaves predictably. But T-Rex would not be a tiger beside a jeep. It would be an animal whose sheer mass could make roads, verges, barriers, and parked cars feel far less reassuring than people wanted them to be. The practical rule in Tyrannosaur range would likely be to remain inside vehicles during sightings, keep distance, avoid blocking or crowding the animal, and never allow traffic jams to become viewing platforms. Authorities would almost certainly create hard standoff distances and strict movement rules, because once a creature that large begins associating stopped human traffic with attention, noise, or food opportunities, the administrative headache becomes geological in scale. This is an inference from modern large carnivore management, but a very grounded one. Then comes the awkward matter of human behaviour during attacks or near attacks, which is never as tidy as safety posters would like. A 2016 study in Scientific Reports argued that human behaviour can trigger large carnivore attacks in developed countries, and a 2023 global review collected 5,440 attacks by large carnivores between 1950 and 2019, noting that while such attacks are rare compared with many other risks, they are serious and are often magnified in public perception. That combination would become central to life with T-Rex. because even if tyrannosaur attacks turned out to be uncommon compared with road deaths, storms, or ordinary human foolishness, each event would be so visible, so dramatic, and so difficult to forget that it would shape national policy and local emotion almost instantly. People do not judge danger by mathematics alone. They judge it by imagery, proximity, and whether the threat can, in principle, eat a tractor. T-Rex would score very highly on all three. This is where fear would begin changing society in subtler ways. Parents would alter school routes. Commuters in range zones would track alerts before dawn travel. Property owners would rethink fencing, lighting, and field placement. Local businesses would adapt hours. Delivery drivers would develop an entire new category of excuse that, for once, no one could mock. The science paper on fear-driven landscapes in other predator systems makes the broader point that fear itself changes movement and space use. With humans, that would happen culturally as much as biologically. Trails would empty after fresh reports. River corridors would feel different. Night would feel different. It is one thing to know abstractly that wilderness contains danger. It is quite another to know that the danger in question stands higher than your roofline and may have excellent long-distance vision and smell. And yet fascination would not weaken. It might even grow stronger under pressure, because forbidden things acquire a certain shine in the human mind. The same species that invented sensible perimeter rules also invented trespassing for a better photograph. There would be people who wanted nothing more than to hear a tyrannosaur call in the distance, see fresh tracks in mud, or witness one crossing a valley at dawn. There would be children who became biologists because of it, artists who spent careers trying to paint it correctly, and tourists who believed rules existed primarily for other tourists. The 2025 review of carnivore perceptions emphasizes that people's responses are shaped by emotion, values, and context, not by facts alone. That would be painfully obvious here. One person would see a living T-Rex as an intolerable threat. Another would see it as proof the world was still worth being astonished by. Both would be looking at the same animal. Because of that split, governments and wildlife agencies would need something larger than a safety leaflet. They would need a culture of coexistence, or at least a culture of disciplined inconvenience. The IUCN guidelines stress that successful conflict management depends on practical local engagement, understanding community concerns, and tailoring responses rather than treating all conflict as one simple problem. In Tyrannosaur country, that would mean rapid reporting systems, trained intervention teams, compensation for losses, clear emergency procedures, and public education strong enough to survive the internet. It would also mean accepting that coexistence is not the same thing as comfort. People might learn to live with T-Rex the way some communities live with bears, tigers, crocodiles, or elephants. But live with does not mean stop caring. It means adapting routines, respecting boundaries, and letting the animal remain wild without allowing every encounter to become a crisis. That is a demanding bargain, but not an impossible one if institutions are honest and responsive. The early years would probably include several hard lessons. Someone would approach too closely for a video. Someone would ignore a closure sign because it ruined their weekend plans. Someone would assume a juvenile was less dangerous because it was smaller, which would be like assuming a truck is harmless because it is not a train. Those incidents would shape the rulebook very fast. Over time, the first rules of survival would become ordinary knowledge in range areas. Stay alert in groups. Keep to approved routes. Do not run. Do not approach. Do not feed. Report carcasses. Respect closures. Give the animal space. Watch for signs long before you watch for the animal itself. In another century, these would feel like ordinary facts of life, as unsurprising to local children as tide charts or storm sirens. But in the beginning, they would feel like civilization rewriting itself under pressure. There would also be a psychological adjustment that no manual could fully teach. Humans like to imagine that knowledge automatically becomes mastery. If we understand an animal, we think we have somehow reduced it. That would fail here. We could map T-Rex, collar it, study its gait, sample its scat, model its territory, and still feel the same old jolt in the spine when one appeared at the edge of visibility. Knowledge would help. Protocols would help. Better roads, stronger fencing, carcass removal, and alert systems would all help. But none of them would erase the basic fact that modern humans had begun sharing space with a predator from deep time. The mind would not stop reacting simply because the paperwork had improved. In some ways, that reaction would be part of survival. Fear, used properly, is not panic. It is respect that arrives in the body before language has finished getting dressed. And after a while, once the first panic settled and the first protocols hardened into routine, something else would happen. Human settlements would begin to arrange themselves around the animal rather than merely reacting to it. Roads, farms, patrol systems, school transport, tourism routes, emergency planning, and land use laws would all start bending, a little at first, and then much more obviously, around the presence of Tyrannosaurus rex. Which is when the story stops being only about encounter and starts becoming something broader. A world with a living T-Rex would not just change the people who met one in the dark or on the roadside, it would change the shape of daily life itself, especially in the places where cities, farms, transport lines, and national borders all had to make room for something large enough to ignore our maps. What changes first in a world with living Tyrannosaurus rex is not the dinosaur. It is the paperwork. That may sound disappointing, but it is exactly how modern society responds when something too large, too dangerous, and too mobile refuses to stay in the category of interesting wildlife and starts interfering with roads, property, livestock, emergency planning, and political careers. Cities would not suddenly become tyrannosaur habitat, not in the full ecological sense, but they would absolutely become tyrannosaur-adjacent systems. Once a giant predator exists within driving distance of settlements, every serious institution begins asking the same unromantic questions. Where can it move? What attracts it? What keeps it out? What happens if it crosses a road, enters cropland, lingers near a suburb, or walks across an international border and turns a biology problem into a diplomatic one? Large carnivore management already works this way now, just on a smaller and less alarming scale. The first visible change would be in land use planning. Modern cities are built on the assumption that the biggest local hazards are weather, traffic, crime, flood, fire, and the occasional unlucky meeting with ordinary wildlife. A tyrannosaur would add a different category altogether, one that forces planners to think about approach corridors, open waste, green belts, transport edges, and the spaces between settlement and wilderness. Research on large carnivores already shows that roads, settlements, and human use reshape how predators move, and when they are active, often pushing them toward avoidance behaviour, but also concentrating risk where habitat is fragmented. In practical terms, a city near Tyrannosaur range would not only monitor the animal itself, it would monitor the landscape features that channel it. River edges, disused industrial belts, rail corridors, peri-urban woodland, landfill zones, and outer agricultural rings would all become serious planning concerns rather than background scenery. That would make suburban expansion much harder to treat as a simple housing matter. Right now, a development proposal near woodland might trigger arguments about traffic, drainage, or protected species. In Tyrannosaur country, it would trigger questions about whether the new neighbourhood sits on a movement route used by a large apex predator. Wildlife connectivity guidance already stresses that ecological corridors matter because fragmentation reduces survival and movement options, especially for wide-ranging animals. So, a world that still contained T-Rex would not be able to keep building wherever a map showed empty land. Some stretches would need to remain open simply because closing them would force giant predators into tighter contact with people. That means zoning laws would become more ecological and less optimistic. Developers would complain. Conservation biologists would produce very large maps. Municipal councils would discover that Green corridor no longer means a pleasant walking path with benches and flowers. Road systems would change next, and perhaps most expensively. Large carnivores already avoid roads, adjust their timing around them, and suffer from the fragmentation roads create. Transportation guidance and road ecology research show why crossing structures, underpasses, and habitat linkages are increasingly important for wildlife movement. With tyrannosaurs, the scale of that need would become much larger, because a creature that big could not simply slip through a culvert and carry on with its evening. Highways in range areas would need major barrier systems, monitored crossing zones, carcass clearance protocols, and alert networks strong enough to close traffic before an animal actually reached the tarmac. People like to imagine the dramatic moment when the dinosaur steps onto the road. The more realistic modern response would be to spend billions trying to make sure that moment almost never happens. Rail infrastructure would be no easier. Freight lines already cut through habitat, and large animals are often poor at negotiating human transport systems that were not designed with them in mind. A tyrannosaur would not need to be hit often for rail authorities to become deeply serious about fencing, sensor systems, vegetation management and buffer design. The issue is not only direct collision, it is attraction. If prey species gather near certain corridors, if carcasses from accidental strikes are left too long, or if rail embankments create convenient travel lines, then the transport network starts participating in the ecology, whether it wants to or not. Once that happens, ministries of transport and wildlife agencies stop being separate conversations. They become one very tense meeting with too many acronyms. Research on connectivity and infrastructure already points in this direction for existing large carnivores. T-Rex would simply remove any room for pretending the problem was optional. Farms would feel the shift more personally and more quickly than cities. The broad social problem with large carnivores is not only fear, it is uneven cost. A 2023 Nature Communications paper notes that the burden of human-wildlife conflict is often unequal, and livestock losses can represent a severe economic shock. Compensation schemes exist for modern carnivore damage, but reviews show mixed results and emphasize that trust, verification, prevention, and locally fair design all matter. In a world with T-Rex, that problem would intensify immediately. Livestock producers near Tyrannosaur range would not be dealing with occasional small losses that can be argued over in abstract policy language. They would be dealing with the possibility of very large stock losses, repeated fence damage, stress on herds, altered calving patterns, and the need to protect animals over much larger areas than current predator-proofing systems were built to cover. Ordinary fencing would stop being a real answer. That does not mean farmers would give up on barriers. It means barriers would have to become layered systems rather than simple boundaries. Modern Europe's large carnivore protection measures already combine electric fencing, guarding dogs, supervision, and compensation tied to prevention. In Tyrannosaur country, farms would likely shift toward clustered protection, hardened night enclosures, calving compounds, rapid carcass removal, surveillance towers, and more centralized grazing patterns near defended areas. The old ideal of letting animals spread widely across open pasture with minimal supervision would become much harder to sustain. Some producers would adapt by changing livestock type, changing location, changing season of use, or leaving vulnerable land uses altogether. Others would demand state support on a scale that would make current carnivore programs look modest. And they would not be wrong to do so, because society would be asking them to absorb costs on behalf of a species everyone else wanted to admire safely from a distance. Food systems around range areas would therefore reorganize. Insurance markets would change, compensation boards would grow, veterinary response would include predator stress, and injury patterns not currently common in industrial agriculture. Slaughterhouse waste, rendering plants, and transport yards would need strict controls to avoid becoming attractants. Local governments would make emergency rules about carcass disposal, because large carnivore guidance already treats access to food waste and dead livestock as a major driver of conflict. It is one thing to lose a sheep to a wolf. It is another to create a regular food signal for a predator large enough to regard a farm edge as a promising feeding zone. Once a few early mistakes made that lesson painfully clear, biosecurity and predator security would start overlapping in ways that modern agriculture has only partly experienced. Borders would create a different kind of mess. Wild animals do not care about lines on maps, but modern states care about them a great deal. Large carnivore conservation already struggles with transboundary populations because animals move between jurisdictions with different laws, monitoring systems, tolerance levels, and political incentives. The European Commission and Council of Europe both point to population-level management and cross-border coordination as essential for large carnivores, precisely because biological populations do not stop neatly at national frontiers. Add T-Rex to that reality, and the argument becomes impossible to ignore. One country's protected apex predator would be another country's emergency response problem by morning if the animal crossed a river valley or mountain pass. You cannot manage a roaming giant predator sensibly one customs post at a time. The instinctive political answer in some places would be fences, and that is where things get even more complicated. Border fence research shows these barriers can fragment populations, block movement, cause direct mortality, and create serious biodiversity costs, especially for large carnivores and herbivores. So, if nations tried to solve the tyrannosaur question with walls and exclusion fencing at scale, they would be creating one problem while worsening several others. A border fence tall and strong enough to deter or redirect a T-Rex would also affect prey movement, corridor function, and the wider ecology of the landscape. It might reduce certain crossings, yes, but it could also force animals into narrower routes, intensify conflict elsewhere, and split what should be one biological population into politically convenient but ecologically unstable pieces. That is not a clean solution. It is a very expensive way of moving the headache sideways. Because of that, modern society would likely split into two schools of thought. One group would push for hard containment around human systems, with intensive fencing, exclusion zones, culls after incidents, and strict separation wherever possible. The other would argue for managed coexistence, meaning corridors, compensation, adaptive management, and serious investment in prevention, rather than pretending the species could be locked permanently into a distant box. Current large carnivore guidance leans toward adaptive population-level management paired with damage prevention and local support, while also acknowledging that lethal control and quotas are politically present in some systems and have to be embedded within monitoring and risk assessment if used at all. A tyrannosaur would make that debate louder, not simpler. The public would want certainty. Ecology would keep offering only trade-offs. Cities near range areas would adapt culturally as well as structurally. School routes might be redesigned. Perimeter alerts would become part of municipal emergency systems. Certain greenways would close at dawn or dusk. Recreation would shift toward monitored zones. Property values would probably behave in contradictory ways, rising for some people who wanted prestige wilderness nearby, and falling for others who preferred their local wildlife not to include a bone-crushing theropod. Tourism boards would try to sound brave. Real estate agents would learn an entire new vocabulary. Local news would run maps more often than anchor smiles. Over time, this would stop feeling extraordinary to residents and start feeling administrative, which is what humans do best with recurring danger. We turn it into forms, timetables, and advice nobody reads until the siren sounds. That adaptation would be social, not merely physical, and studies of human-wildlife conflict consistently show that attitudes, trust, and lived context drive whether coexistence succeeds. There would also be a new layer of surveillance built into society. Cameras, thermal detection, GPS tracking, eDNA sampling, livestock alerts, road sensors, and regional warning systems are already used in pieces for modern wildlife management. With T-Rex, those would no longer be optional specialist tools. they would become part of ordinary governance in range landscapes. Counties and provinces would want near real-time data. Farmers would want rapid notification. Border agencies would want movement records. Transport ministries would want predictive closures rather than surprises. The European Commission's recent support for large carnivore monitoring reflects the same basic logic on a smaller scale. If animals move across large areas and management decisions matter, then monitoring has to be systematic, cooperative, and ongoing. A tyrannosaur would not just be an animal in the landscape, it would be a data problem on legs. Law would change too. Liability rules, compensation standards, landowner duties, public access law, livestock protection obligations, and even criminal penalties around harassment or feeding would all need revision. Modern large carnivore systems already struggle over who pays, who decides, who verifies losses, and what counts as acceptable risk. With T-Rex, those questions would get heavier fast. If a regional authority failed to remove a carcass that later attracted a tyrannosaur near a village, who was responsible? If a landowner ignored mandatory prevention rules and then demanded full public compensation, how would that be judged? If a tourist entered a closed corridor to film a crossing and triggered a dangerous incident, would that be treated as trespass, wildlife harassment, public endangerment, or all three? When society changes around a dangerous species, courts end up learning a great deal about ecology whether they wanted to or not. What is easy to miss in all this is that T-Rex would not need to be common to produce major social change. Large carnivores already shape human systems out of proportion to their numbers because they are wide-ranging, attention-heavy and politically loaded. A sparse population of tyrannosaurs across a large region would still be enough to alter farm economics, corridor design, transport planning, insurance, border cooperation, and municipal behaviour. In some places, the animal would remain mostly unseen, known through tracks, alerts, and the occasional bad night for livestock. In other places, it would become a recurring public presence. Either way, the society around it would begin to show the marks of accommodation. More monitored edges, more protected corridors, fewer casual assumptions about what open land means, more respect for the difference between empty space on a map and usable space in an ecosystem. And that is probably the deepest change of all. A living tyrannosaur would force modern society to admit that infrastructure is never neutral. Roads direct movement. Farms create food opportunities and conflict. Cities generate edges. Borders interrupt ecological reality. Every part of human order would either block, attract, redirect, or endanger the animal, and in return the animal would push back by making those effects visible. It would expose where our landscapes are too fragmented, where our policies stop at the map line instead of the biological population, and where our confidence in control depends mainly on the fact that nothing very large has tested it lately. Once that test arrived, the next question would come naturally. Could we actually contain something like this? Or would all our fences, parks, tranquilizers, and tracking systems only prove that control sounds much more complete on paper than it feels when the paper starts moving through the tree line? Once Tyrannosaurus rex becomes a real animal in a real country with real roads, real budgets, and real lawyers, the question changes. It is no longer, could we stop one if we absolutely had to? It becomes, what exactly do we mean by contain? Because there is a great difference between displaying one, holding one temporarily, moving one, monitoring one in the wild, and controlling an entire breeding population across a landscape. Modern zoo standards, wildlife conflict guidance, and large carnivore monitoring all point to the same uncomfortable truth. We are quite good at managing danger in layers, but much less good at eliminating it completely. A living T-Rex would expose that distinction immediately. If the question is whether we could keep a single T-Rex in something like a zoological institution, the answer is probably yes, but only in the same way one can say it is possible to build a vault around lightning. It would not be simple, cheap, or graceful. standards used for dangerous zoo animals already require standoff barriers to prevent direct public contact, and the current UK standards of modern zoo practice make clear that hazardous animals need public barriers designed to stop people getting through, under or over them. On the animal care side, elephant standards from AZA and EAZA stress something equally important. Large, dangerous, intelligent animals do not just need strong containment, they need space, environmental complexity, natural substrates, shelter, bathing options, separation areas, and constant observation tools such as CCTV. A T-Rex enclosure, by inference, would need all of those welfare features plus a far higher margin of structural safety. It would be less like a cage and more like a fortified habitat, with multiple rings of failure built into it. That is where the public imagination usually goes wrong. People tend to picture containment as a wall. Institutions that actually manage dangerous animals think in systems. Barrier 1 keeps the animal in, Barrier 2 keeps the public out, Barrier 3 keeps staff alive if Barrier 1 behaves rudely. Then there are gates, lockouts, isolation yards, remote feeding systems, off-show holding areas, medical restraint spaces, redundant power systems, and emergency protocols written by people who have lost all patience for improvisation. A T-Rex would require exactly that mentality, only more so. The USD AAPHIS public barrier study treats elephants, rhinos, hippos, bears, big cats, wolves, and great apes as dangerous animal cases where direct public contact must be prevented. A tyrannosaur would sit beyond that list in both size and uncertainty, which means any institution housing one would have to assume that every ordinary safety rule must be expanded, not relaxed. Even then, the problem would not only be strength, it would be behaviour. Modern elephant standards keep returning to choice, complexity, and the ability of animals to separate, move, bathe, scratch, rest, and socialise or avoid socialising. That is not sentimentality, it is management. Animals under chronic stress, boredom, crowding, or frustration often become harder to predict, harder to handle, and more dangerous to keep. So a T-Rex enclosure built purely as a fortress, with no meaningful room or stimulation, would likely be a bad containment plan disguised as a dramatic one. If the animal were healthy, it would need room to move and make decisions. If it were unhealthy, it would become a medical and safety crisis inside its own walls. Containment, in other words, would have to serve welfare and security at the same time, which is expensive even for elephants and great apes. For something the size and uncertainty of a tyrannosaur, it would be institution shaping. There would also be the awkward matter of visibility. The public likes seeing famous animals. Safe institutions tend to be less enthusiastic about giving dangerous animals too many clean opportunities to interact with the public. Existing zoo standards for hazardous species emphasise standoff barriers, risk assessments, supervised access, and strong restrictions around direct exposure. One set of EAZA standards notes that where dangerous carnivores and other hazardous wild animals are kept, vehicles without a solid roof should not be allowed access, and rescue capacity must be immediately available. That gives a useful clue to what a tyrannosaur exhibit would become. Not a thrilling open truck ride with cheerful narration, but a heavily controlled viewing system with distance, hardened observation structures, and a rescue plan serious enough to make the brochure sound nervous. It would still attract enormous crowds, of course. Humans are consistent that way, but the institution would be designed on the assumption that excitement is the public's contribution, not the animals'. If, however, the question shifts from one animal in custody to a population in the wild, containment starts meaning something completely different. You're no longer asking, can we keep it behind barriers? You're asking, can we keep it mostly where we want it, mostly away from where we do not want it, for years at a time across weather, breeding, dispersal, prey shifts, damaged infrastructure, and human impatience? Modern carnivore research gives a firm but slightly irritating answer. Fences can help, often substantially, but they are rarely magic. A 2023 study on lions and hyenas in Namibia found that the Etosha perimeter fence was a partial barrier to lions and even more permeable to hyenas, with hotspot crossings that mattered for both conflict and connectivity. The authors also note that fences require substantial money and manpower to maintain. That is not failure, that is reality. A fence is not a final answer. It is a line of negotiation that the landscape keeps revisiting. At the same time, fencing can be very effective under the right conditions. A widely cited 2013 analysis of 42 lion sites found that lion populations in fenced reserves were maintained much closer to estimated carrying capacity than unfenced populations, and at far lower annual management budgets per square kilometre. That is a serious result, but it comes with a serious implication. Containment through fencing tends to work best when the whole system accepts the cost of making the fence central to management. It is not a casual perimeter, it is infrastructure, maintenance, staffing, and policy. So yes, a giant predator can be managed more tightly inside a fenced reserve than across an open landscape. But the reserve then becomes a machine that must be operated continuously. The moment people imagine a fence as a one-time expense rather than a permanent obligation, they begin losing the argument. A T-Rex would make that lesson painfully clear. There is another trade-off hidden in those fence systems. The more successful the barrier, the less natural the population often becomes in its long-term movement. That matters because apex predators are not ornaments. They disperse, establish territories, respond to prey, and create ecological effects across space. Once you hold them inside smaller managed units, you often create a need for more human intervention later, whether through genetic management, translocations, contraception, or active conflict prevention at the boundary. Some conservation work on fenced lion metapopulations already points in this direction. That does not mean fence systems are wrong, it means they are not the same as full wildness. For T-Rex, a heavily fenced reserve might be the safest politically, but it would also be the most obviously artificial, a world in which every failure of natural movement comes back to human management with paperwork attached. And once an animal gets out or simply turns up where it is not wanted, people naturally reach for relocation. This sounds humane, tidy, and admirably grown up. Wildlife professionals are much less romantic about it. The APHIS Technical Review on Wildlife Translocation says plainly that translocation is often perceived by the public as humane, safe, and effective, but that the vast majority of wildlife professionals do not agree, and that it should only rarely be recommended for addressing conflict. The reasons include animal stress, handler risk, legal issues, disease movement, and increased risk of death to the animal. The older review of carnivore translocation adds another uncomfortable point. Large carnivores often move enormous distances after release, sometimes returning to the capture site over hundreds of kilometers, and very few stay where managers politely ask them to remain. So if a problem tyrannosaur began using farmland or moving near settlements, trucking it elsewhere would not be a neat reset button. It would be a high-risk gamble with a long receipt. This is where control begins to reveal its limits. Containment sounds decisive when spoken at podium. In the field, it becomes maintenance, monitoring, and response. You fence what you can, harden what you must, and track as much as possible, but you still live inside probabilities rather than guarantees. Modern large carnivore monitoring standards in Europe make that plain in a calmer way. They emphasize that high-quality demographic data supports better decision-making, and they lay out monitoring systems that rely on multiple methods: camera trapping, genetic analysis, opportunistic reports, sign surveys, and telemetry. Crucially, the same standards note that telemetry on its own is not a monitoring method. It provides valuable information on territory size, habitat use, and mortality, but it has to be used to calibrate a broader program. That would apply even more strongly to T-Rex. A collar would tell you where one individual had been. It would not tell you everything else you needed to know. So the modern Tyrannosaur management toolkit would almost certainly become layered. GPS collars on selected individuals, perhaps large adults and dispersing subadults. Camera networks on travel corridors, carcass sites and fence lines. Genetic sampling from scat, tissue, saliva on kills, or shed material if such samples proved usable. Public reporting systems for tracks, calls or sightings. Drones where weather and law allowed. Satellite-linked alerts for road and farm managers in active zones. But even with all that, large carnivore standards repeatedly warn of imperfect detection and the need to avoid double counting, especially across borders. Wildlife that ranges broadly is always partly ahead of the map. A T-Rex would simply be a larger, louder reminder of that fact. We could know much more than earlier humans ever could, but we would not know everything in real time, and institutions built on the fantasy of perfect knowledge would discover that first. Then there is the issue that modern people always save for later because it is messy, expensive and frankly alarming. How do you physically restrain or sedate something when tracking is not enough? Perhaps it is injured. Perhaps it is trapped in a bad place. Perhaps it must undergo veterinary treatment. This is the point at which the conversation leaves optimism and enters pharmacology. Capture-related mortality in large free-ranging mammals is already a recognised risk, with a 2006 review noting that chemical capture and anaesthesia always carry some danger even in healthy animals, from overdose, trauma, drowning, stress, myopathy, and equipment-related effects. The same author suggested wildlife professionals should strive for zero mortality, and that rates above 2% probably should not be accepted in large mammalian species. That is for animals we actually know how to handle. It is not difficult to imagine how much more uncertain this becomes with the Tyrannosaur. If T-Rex physiology turned out to share meaningful traits with large reptiles or crocodilians in some areas, veterinary management might become even trickier. A 2024 systematic review on crocodilian sedation and general anaesthesia notes that anaesthesia is complicated by aggressive nature, poikilothermic physiology, and species-specific anatomical and physiological characteristics, and that the literature remains limited. The review highlights how temperature, dose, administration route, species, and age all influence protocols. That is not a recipe for confidence when the patient has a skull the size of a bathtub and a tail capable of reorganising your treatment bay. Even if tyrannosaurs proved more metabolically bird-like than crocodilian, the broader lesson remains. We would not step into this with a mature handbook. We would build one gradually, case by case, under a level of risk that no sane veterinarian would describe as routine. This means that capture and hold would likely be reserved for exceptional circumstances, not everyday management. A zoo might maintain a dedicated, highly engineered restraint system for a resident animal because it had no alternative. Field teams dealing with free-ranging tyrannosaurs would be far more cautious. Most of the time, the safest strategy would probably be not to immobilise the animal at all unless the expected benefit clearly outweighed the risk to the animal, the staff, and the public. That conclusion fits broader human-carnivore conflict evidence too. A 2022 review found that non-lethal interventions are more likely to reduce conflict, while translocations and lethal interventions are mostly ineffective or harmful in the long run. For a giant predator, the practical reading is obvious. Prevent the encounter when possible. Redirect behaviour where you can. Avoid creating new crises with dramatic interventions unless there is no better option. There is also a psychological limit to control that deserves attention. The more powerful the monitoring system becomes, the more people begin assuming the animal is under constant command. It would not be. A collar battery can fail, a fence can degrade, a camera can miss a crossing, a juvenile can disperse beyond the pattern expected from adults, heavy rain can wipe away track evidence, human reporting can be wrong, late, panicked, or, just to keep morale low, occasionally inventive. Modern monitoring standards include public sightings and livestock damage records, because those imperfect streams still matter, but they are not the same as certainty. In Tyrannosaur country, people would learn to live with a degree of managed uncertainty. That phrase would appear in official language a great deal. Citizens would dislike it intensely. It would remain true anyway. So can we contain it? In a strict sense, yes, sometimes. One individual in a world-class institution, probably. A small population inside a massive, intensively managed fenced reserve, perhaps. A broad, wild population perfectly contained across nations, roads, farms, and generations. No. That last version is not how living predators work, and modern conservation practice does not pretend otherwise. What we call control in the real world is usually a bundle of compromises, strong barriers in some places, open corridors in others, emergency response teams, tracking and evidence collection, compensation schemes, hard rules about food waste, livestock carcasses and public access, non-lethal prevention as the first line, sedation and relocation only when the alternatives are worse. None of that sounds as clean as a steel gate slamming shut behind a dinosaur, but it is much closer to the truth. And there is one more limit that no wall solves. The more completely we contain an animal, the less we are living with it as a wild species, and the more we are running it as a dangerous asset. That may be acceptable for one individual in a research facility. It becomes much harder to defend for an entire species if the stated goal is coexistence rather than permanent custody. At some point, containment stops being conservation and starts becoming highly expensive denial. A living T-Rex would force that distinction into the open. Did we want the animal alive? Or did we want it nearby, only on terms that made it behave like a museum with pulse and appetite? Modern carnivore policy already circles this tension. A tyrannosaur would simply make it impossible to ignore. All of which leaves us in a rather interesting place. We could build barriers, write procedures, install cameras, fit collars, and move heaven and budget lines trying to keep Tyrannosaurus rex predictable. Some of that would work well. Some of it would work only until weather, breeding, or one determined individual reminded us that control is not the same as obedience. And that is precisely why scientists, veterinarians, and paleontologists would become so obsessed with studying the animal directly. If perfect containment is impossible, then understanding becomes even more valuable. Every scan, blood sample, trackway, healing fracture, growth curve, vocalization, and behavioral record would matter, because the better we understood the animal itself, the better our chances of living alongside it without pretending we had mastered something we had only just met. Once the fences, cameras, permits, and emergency plans were in place, science would begin the sort of quiet, relentless work it always does when the impossible suddenly becomes available for study. A living Tyrannosaurus rex would trigger one of the largest research efforts in modern biological history, because it would not just add a new species to science, it would reopen whole areas of paleontology that currently rely on indirect evidence, comparative anatomy, and carefully argued inference. At the moment, researchers reconstruct T-Rex from bones, teeth, histology, trace fossils, exceptional soft tissue preservation, and comparisons with birds and crocodilians. Those tools are powerful, but they are still partial. A living animal would let scientists compare the real creature against decades of reconstruction and discover, very quickly, which ideas were close, which were incomplete, and which were about to age badly in public. Biologists would begin with the most ordinary questions, because ordinary questions are often the ones fossils answer least cleanly. How fast does it grow in real time? How long does it remain juvenile? When does it become sexually mature? How much size variation is normal within one population? Current histology already gives an increasingly detailed picture. A 2026 Piaget study built from a larger Tyrannosaurus growth dataset argues that the species may have taken close to 40 years to reach full size, much longer than earlier estimates near 25 years, and a 2020 growth series study in Piaget emphasized just how much shape changed through ontogeny. a living T-Rex would let researchers finally match bones to actual life stages, which means growth curves would stop being a statistical reconstruction alone and become something observed year by year, individual by individual. That would matter more than it sounds. Right now, when paleontologists argue over whether two fossils represent different species, different sexes, or simply different ages, they are doing so with a record full of gaps. Live tyrannosaurs would give them developmental benchmarks that fossils alone cannot. Skull proportions, limb robustness, tooth replacement patterns, muscle growth, body depth, and even behaviour across adolescence could be tracked directly. The 2020 Science Advances study on Nanotyrannus argued that supposed small tyrannosaur forms were immature animals, not a separate genus based on osteohistology. A living population would let scientists test that whole principle in real time. How many dramatic anatomical differences can appear inside one species before human taxonomy gets overexcited and starts naming them? Paleontology would become much less speculative in some places and much more embarrassing in others. Movement would be another major prize. At present, even well-supported biomechanics still leave room for debate. A 2021 Royal Society Open Science study estimated a preferred walking speed for T-Rex around 1.28 meters per second, while earlier biomechanical modelling argued strongly against the old idea of T-Rex as an exceptionally fast runner. Those are careful, evidence-based estimates, but they are still estimates. A living animal would allow force plate studies, high-speed motion capture, pressure mapping of the feet, direct observation of stride adjustment on different terrain, and actual measurement of energy use during locomotion. It would settle how the tail behaved during turns, how much shock the neck absorbed during feeding, how efficiently such a large body could accelerate, and whether the real gait looked more bird-like, more crocodilian, or uniquely tyrannosaur in ways no model had fully captured. Metabolism would become one of the biggest scientific battlegrounds, though it might be settled faster than many older debates. Researchers have used bone histology, growth rates, and isotopic methods to argue that dinosaurs were not simply sluggish reptile analogues, and a 2011 science paper inferred dinosaur body temperatures from isotopic clumping in eggshells and teeth. That work is impressive, but a live T, Rex would allow direct measurements of body temperature across the day, growth-linked metabolic demand, breathing rates, blood chemistry, recovery after exertion, and seasonal variation. Biologists would learn very quickly whether tyrannosaur physiology sat closer to birds, closer to reptiles, or on its own branch of energetic compromise. And once that happened, paleontologists would revisit not only T-Rex, but a great many other dinosaurs whose biology has long been interpreted through it. The outside of the animal would cause a small scientific stampede all by itself. Current evidence from Tyrannosauroid integument strongly supports scales over at least substantial parts of the body, while also showing that earlier tyrannosauroids had more extensive feathering and that the history of tyrannosaur skin was more complicated than a simple feathered versus scaly argument. That means a living T-Rex would not just settle a museum artist argument, it would calibrate the whole logic of how paleontologists reconstruct skin coverings from incomplete evidence. Scientists would document scale size, distribution, flexibility, seasonal shedding if any occurred, juvenile versus adult surface changes, heat management strategies, display structures, scars, and colour patterning. The exact coloration would be a major breakthrough, because fossil evidence can sometimes narrow colour possibilities in feathered taxa through melanosomes, but it does not hand us a neat paint chart for adult tyrannosaurs. Live skin would do that in an afternoon. Its senses would be just as valuable. Current tyrannosaur sensory reconstructions suggest excellent smell, strong binocular vision, coordinated head and eye movements, and likely sensitivity to lower frequency sound. Those conclusions come from endocasts, cranial anatomy, and comparative work, and they already paint T-Rex as a much better sensory animal than the old brute stereotype allowed. A living specimen would let researchers go far beyond that. Ophthalmologists could examine retinal structure and visual fields. Auditory biologists could determine actual hearing thresholds and frequency ranges. Neurobiologists could test how rapidly it oriented to movement, scent, and sound. Behavioural ecologists could observe whether it relied more on scent at dusk, more on sight in open country, or more on low-frequency cues during long-distance communication. In short, the tyrannosaur would stop being a sensory inference and become an active data source with a very large mouth attached. The voice would probably become one of the first obsessions outside science, and one of the first serious corrections within it. At present, researchers can infer some things from ear anatomy, and from the relationship between body size and sound frequency in living archosaurs, but they cannot tell us exactly what T-Rex sounded like in life. A living animal would settle that instantly. Scientists could record alarm calls, contact calls, mating vocalizations, juvenile begging sounds, territorial displays, and quiet close-range communication. The public, of course, would focus on whether it roared. Researchers would be more interested in structure, frequency, repetition, seasonal use, and how vocal behaviour related to distance and social context. It would be one of the rare moments when a major scientific question could be answered simply by standing at the right distance with excellent microphones and even better insurance. Feeding biology would become far less guesswork too. Right now, the evidence already tells a compelling story. The 2017 Scientific Reports Bite Force study found adult bite force estimates in the tens of thousands of newtons and supported deep bone penetration and bone-crushing feeding. The 2013 PNAS study with a healed hadrosaur tail bite showed Tyrannosaurus attacked living prey, while the 2023 Science Advances Stomach Content Discovery in a young tyrannosaurid showed a juvenile was eating small prey, supporting age-related dietary shifts. A living T-Rex would let scientists watch how those pieces fit together. How often did adults hunt compared with scavenge? How selective were they? How long did feeding bouts last? How much of a carcass was used? How did juveniles avoid competing directly with adults? What looked like separate arguments in fossils would become one continuous biological story. Social behaviour would be another area where direct observation would save decades of argument. Trackways from British Columbia have been interpreted as evidence consistent with some degree of gregariousness in tyrannosaurids. But footprints alone cannot tell us whether adults formed stable groups, whether family units stayed together, or whether temporary associations around food were more common than lasting bonds. A living population would settle that quickly. Field biologists would know whether T-Rex was mostly solitary, socially flexible, seasonally tolerant, or genuinely group-oriented during parts of its life. They could measure spacing between adults, juvenile dependence, territorial overlap, mating season behaviour, and how individuals behaved at carcasses. That may sound like a narrow scientific question, but it would transform everything from reserve design to public safety planning. It is hard to manage a predator properly when you do not know whether one track means one animal or several moving through on the same bad afternoon. Reproduction would become a field unto itself. The identification of medullary bone in Tyrannosaurus has already provided strong evidence that at least some females produced a bird-like reproductive tissue associated with egg-laying, which is one of the most useful biological links between non-avian dinosaurs and living birds. But fossils only take us so far. A living T-Rex would allow scientists to document courtship, nesting sites, clutch size, egg shape, eggshell microstructure, incubation temperature, nesting interval, juvenile growth after hatching, and whether adults guarded nests or young. The medullary bone evidence tells us reproductive physiology was doing something bird-like, at least in part. Live animals would show how far that similarity went, and whether tyrannosaur parenting was closer to crocodilian guarding, bird-like nesting, some mixture of both, or something not currently represented well by either living branch. Veterinarians would have an entirely different kind of revolution. Fossils already show that dinosaurs were not pristine symbols of evolutionary power. They got sick, injured, infected, and healed. A 2020 scientific report study used CT imaging and phylogenetic disease bracketing to argue that a T-Rex specimen showed osteomyelitis rather than cancer, and other work on dinosaur pathologies has shown how much medical information is trapped in bone if one knows how to look. A living tyrannosaur would let vets connect bone lesions to real disease processes rather than infer them through modern relatives alone. They could study wound healing rates, immune response, oral bacteria, parasite load, tendon injuries, fracture repair, stress markers, age-related degeneration, and how frequently fights left lasting damage. Paleopathology would stop being a quiet detective story and become active medicine with unusually bad consequences for clinical mistakes. Sedation, restraint, and surgery would be among the hardest lessons. Even in living crocodilians, a 2024 systematic review found anesthesia complicated by aggressive behaviour, species differences, temperature effects, route of administration, and limited evidence. That matters because crocodilians are among the closest living archosaur relatives available for practical veterinary comparison. A live T-Rex would force veterinarians to create entirely new protocols for immobilization, monitoring, airway control, pain management, and recovery in an animal with no modern equivalent in size or anatomy. Every successful exam, scan, or surgical procedure would become a scientific paper. Every failed dose calculation would become a national emergency, and probably a documentary later, which is not a research incentive anyone really wants. Then there is genetics, which would be almost embarrassingly useful. Fossil science can recover some molecular information from deep time, especially proteins and protein-derived residues in favourable cases, but DNA preservation beyond the quaternary remains deeply uncertain and heavily constrained by decay. A 2021 Earth Science Review's reassessment did not rule out all molecular possibilities in deep time, but it did emphasise how much remains unresolved, and broader work on DNA decay has long pointed to extreme limits on useful survival over millions of years. Living tissue would end the waiting. Scientists could sequence the entire genome, compare regulatory systems with birds and crocodilians, map immune genes, developmental pathways, pigment-related genes, and reproductive biology, and finally test which parts of dinosaur-bird continuity are deep homology and which are more distant analogy. It would be the difference between peering through frosted glass and opening the door. That genomic work would also rebound back into paleontology. Right now, some of the most exciting fossil molecule studies involve collagen and other preserved biomolecular traces, along with ongoing debates about what truly survives, what gets chemically altered, and how to tell original signals from contamination or transformation. A live T-Rex would give researchers a benchmark for comparison that fossils have never been able to provide: protein sequences, tissue chemistry, bone cell morphology, blood physiology, feather or scale development, and collagen structure could be documented directly and then matched against fossil residues from tyrannosaurs and related taxa. Entire controversies about deep-time molecular preservation would become easier to sort once the correct answer from the living animal sat in front of the instruments instead of behind 66 million years of guesswork. Paleontologists, meanwhile, would discover that some of the most valuable lessons were not glamorous at all. They would learn which skeletal features changed with ordinary posture, which marks on bone came from disease rather than species difference, how much individual variation existed in the skull, and which dramatic-looking structures in museum mounts were actually softened, padded, or partially hidden in life by muscle, skin, keratin, and soft tissue. Work in paleoneurology already shows how much neuroimaging and endocasts can teach us about fossil brains, but a living T-Rex would reveal the gap between internal architecture and observed behaviour in the clearest possible way. The entire field of reconstruction would become better calibrated, less confident in some habits, and much sharper in others. In museum terms, a lot of labels would need updating, and some exhibit artists would be forced into a period of quiet reflection. There is also a more human effect that science would not escape. Researchers would form attachments. Field biologists would begin recognizing individuals by gait, scars, or head shape. Veterinarians would know which animals tolerated close machinery poorly, and which recovered faster than expected. Paleontologists who had spent careers working from fossils would suddenly have to reckon with the living version looking back at them, moving, choosing, and refusing to stay still for the sketch. That shift would matter because it changes the kind of science people do. Once an extinct giant becomes a living subject, questions sharpen. You stop asking only what a bone could mean and start asking what the animal itself is doing right now, and whether the fossil record has been whispering the answer for years without quite making itself plain enough. And yet, for all this learning, science would not become simple. A living T-Rex would answer old questions, but it would also generate new ones at a very unhelpful rate. How many individuals can one ecosystem really support? How do disease outbreaks move through such a species? What happens when climate shifts alter prey ranges? How do you maintain veterinary care, field research, biosecurity and public safety around an animal this large without warping its natural behaviour beyond recognition? In other words, the closer science got, the more expensive knowledge would become. Because the great lesson of biology is that understanding an organism is never free. It costs time, risk, equipment, staff, land, and a great deal of patience. And with Tyrannosaurus rex, every one of those costs would be very large indeed, which is why the next thing society would have to confront is not only what we could learn from keeping one alive, but what it would actually take to do it. The romantic version of a living Tyrannosaurus rex usually ends at the moment someone says, "Imagine seeing one." The expensive version begins a few seconds later, when somebody else has to ask who is paying for the land, the food, the staff, the veterinary systems, the quarantine procedures, the transport hardware, the insurance, the perimeter monitoring, the carcass disposal, the emergency response teams, and the public safety plans detailed enough to survive contact with reality. That is when the fantasy becomes administration, and administration, as it turns out, is where many magnificent ideas begin to sweat. Modern zoo and wildlife standards already show that large dangerous animals are not managed through one barrier or one team, but through linked systems of welfare, accommodation, veterinary care, safety, health, and emergency response. A T-Rex would sit beyond all current examples in size and uncertainty, which means the cost of keeping one alive would not be just higher than usual. It would be a different order of burden altogether. It is worth being honest at the start about one thing. No one can give a credible exact yearly price for a living T-Rex because no institution has ever housed one, and no ecosystem now budgets around one. Any confident number would be theatre. What we can say with some confidence is which categories of cost would dominate and why they would rise so quickly. Food would be one, space would be another. Disease surveillance and veterinary care would become permanent line items rather than occasional concerns. Environmental strain would follow closely behind, because even if the animal itself stayed healthy, the land around it would have to absorb the effect of keeping such a predator fed and stable. In practice, the cost of a tyrannosaur would never be only the cost of the animal. It would be the cost of everything the animal forced the rest of the system to become. Food comes first because appetite is not just a feeding problem, it is an infrastructure problem. A science paper on carnivore scaling found a striking general rule. About 10,000 kilograms of prey supports only about 90 kilograms of carnivore biomass, regardless of body mass. That does not mean we can do tidy dinosaur bookkeeping and know exactly what one adult tyrannosaur would need every month. Biology is never that polite. But it does tell us something very useful. Large carnivores sit on top of a very large pyramid of prey. If the predator is enormous, the supporting prey base must be enormous too. An adult T-Rex, commonly reconstructed in the 6 to 9 ton range, would therefore require access to a prey system that was huge by modern standards, whether in the wild or in some heavily managed reserve. The animal itself would be impressive. The prey bill underneath it would be the truly frightening part. In a captive or semi-captive setting, that cost would become bluntly visible. You would not be feeding pellets, tidy cuts, or occasional enrichment snacks and calling the matter closed. A tyrannosaur would need large volumes of whole animal nutrition, including muscle, connective tissue, organs, and probably substantial hard tissue if we take its bone-crushing feeding biology seriously. That means cold chain logistics, biosecure sourcing, storage capacity, waste handling, staff protection during feeding, and veterinary nutrition tailored to a species with no living care manual. The nearest comparison is not an oversized crocodile exhibit or a very ambitious big cat house. It is the cumulative burden of feeding and medically supporting a dangerous megafaunal animal whose natural feeding style would be rough on infrastructure and possibly rougher on staff schedules. Zoo welfare standards already treat diet, environment, veterinary care, and the animal's ability to express species-specific choices as inseparable. For a T-Rex, food would be tied to all of them. Feed too little and you create welfare and risk problems. Feed poorly and you create health problems. Feed in the wrong way and you create behavior problems. None of those are cheap. In the wild, the arithmetic becomes less visible but more severe. You're no longer buying carcasses and building freezers. You're asking the landscape to provide enough prey biomass continuously. That is harder, because large herbivores are already under pressure globally. Science advances reported that about 60% of the world's large herbivores are threatened with extinction or declining, which matters here because a giant predator cannot live on scenery and good intentions. If a reserve or open landscape tried to support even a small tyrannosaur population, it would need enough healthy large-bodied prey to absorb predation, scavenging, disease, drought, breeding cycles, and normal ecological variation without crashing. The problem is not simply that T-Rex would eat a lot. The problem is that the prey system supporting it would have to remain productive at scale, in a century when many large herbivores already struggle to do so. That leads directly to space, because food and land cannot be separated. Capacity to support predators scales with habitat size and prey resources, and large carnivores need large connected areas, precisely because the prey they depend on is spread out rather than stacked neatly in one convenient valley. Current zoo and aquarium standards make the same point in a controlled setting from the opposite direction. Welfare is not just shelter. It depends on environment, diet, health, social conditions where relevant, and the animal's ability to have species-specific choices and some control over its surroundings. For elephants, which are among the largest and most management-intensive animals in human care today, EAZA best practice guidance emphasises not merely minimum accommodation, but the desirable design of enclosures and the conditions considered optimal for the species. A T-Rex would push that logic much farther. Keeping one alive well would not mean asking how little space it could tolerate. It would mean asking how much space it needed to remain physically fit, behaviourally functional, and medically manageable without spending its life pacing the edge of human convenience. This is where the cost stops being about acreage alone and starts becoming about the quality of that acreage. Empty ground is not useful if it lacks drainage, shelter, substrate variation, access lanes for keepers, veterinary isolation zones, secure transport routes, water management, and a perimeter that can survive weather as well as impact. Even current dangerous animal standards assume public standoff barriers, emergency planning, escape protocols, and liability coverage. Elephant guidelines go further and discuss restraint, transport, training walls, geriatric care, daily foot health, and the need to plan movements well in advance. That is for an animal we know how to manage. A T-Rex would require a facility built less like a traditional zoo enclosure and more like a fortified landscape with its own logistics network. It would need room for rest, shade, exercise, separation during treatment, and secure shifting between zones, because any veterinary procedure, move, or emergency would be too dangerous to improvise. Space, then, would not be a luxury. It would be the core operating expense wearing the friendly disguise of habitat. Then there is disease, which is where even good plans begin to look fragile. The World Organization for Animal Health's 2025 guidance on the wildlife-livestock interface makes two sobering points. First, wildlife-livestock systems create multiple pathways for disease spillover, including direct, indirect, and vector-mediated transmission through contaminated water, feed, and shared space. Second, management at that interface usually reduces risk rather than eliminating it. It cannot simply guarantee disease-free status. That is a very important distinction. In a world with T-Rex, every overlap with livestock, carcass sites, shared water, scavenging opportunities, transport yards, or enclosed prey reserves would become a disease management concern. And because no living tyrannosaur exists for us to study in advance, the early years would be full of uncertainty about what pathogens it could carry, amplify, or suffer from. Good veterinary services would reduce risk. They would not remove it. That means disease surveillance would become permanent, expensive, and deeply unglamorous. WOAH's surveillance guidance notes that wildlife disease monitoring is a useful and complementary part of animal health surveillance, prevention, control, and conservation. In practice, that would mean regular environmental sampling, necropsy teams, quarantine facilities, transport sanitation, livestock biosecurity plans around Tyrannosaur range, and rapid reporting networks for unexplained deaths in prey animals or strange behaviour in the predator itself. If a ranch lost cattle near known T-Rex movement corridors, that would no longer be just an insurance question. It would also be a veterinary intelligence question. Was it predation, scavenging, a disease cluster, contaminated water, a bridge host moving pathogens between livestock and wildlife? Those are the kinds of problems that already occupy wildlife veterinary systems now. A tyrannosaur would simply enlarge them until nobody could pretend they were niche. Human care would add its own medical burdens. Even elephant guidelines for an animal with decades of husbandry knowledge behind it devote extensive attention to restraint, transport, daily health checks, foot condition, lesion care, antibiotics, radiographs, geriatric management, and necropsy reporting. That is not because elephants are badly designed. It is because very large animals are inherently costly to maintain well. Their feet, joints, skin, transport needs, and sedation risks all scale upward with size and longevity. A T-Rex would inherit the same general problem and add a long list of unknowns on top. How do you safely collect blood? How do you image internal injury? How do you treat a deep bite wound from another tyrannosaur? How do you manage chronic joint degeneration in old age? How do you move the animal for surgery or quarantine? None of those questions would remain theoretical for long, and every answer would require custom equipment, specialist staff, and contingency plans that cost money even when nothing goes wrong, especially when nothing goes wrong. The environmental strain would be just as serious as the veterinary strain, and in some places much harder to justify politically. Top predators and large herbivores structure ecosystems together. Science has repeatedly shown that removing top predators can trigger trophic cascades and reshape vegetation and herbivore behaviour, while rewilding work has emphasised that the loss or return of top carnivores and large herbivores can alter ecosystem susceptibility and food web dynamics. Put plainly, a giant predator does not merely sit on top of an ecosystem and draw admiration. It changes the behaviour and distribution of prey, which changes browsing pressure, movement routes, carcass availability, scavenger opportunities, and sometimes vegetation patterns. If you kept a tyrannosaur population alive in a restricted reserve, you would not just be paying to maintain the predator, you would be paying to manage the entire ecological reaction around it. That reaction can become especially expensive when the habitat's too small. Fenced predator systems sometimes work better demographically than unfenced ones, but they also make management more hands-on and less forgiving. Prey populations may need close monitoring to avoid overpredation or crash. Carcasses may need to be removed or tested during disease events. Animal movements may need to be manipulated when breeding patterns or territorial pressure become unstable. The result is that containment does not free you from ecological cost. It often converts ecological cost into managerial cost. You trade open uncertainty for permanent intervention, and because T-Rex would be so large, every intervention would be oversized too. More land than a normal reserve, more prey buffering than a normal carnivore program, more staff, more transport, more security, more veterinary backup. The animal would make rarity expensive, not cheap. Climate and drought would make matters worse. A recent Science Advances study reported that human-wildlife conflict is amplified during periods of drought, noting that reduced precipitation can lower plant biomass, stress herbivores, and increase conflict pressure. For a tyrannosaur system, drought would not simply mean the predator was thirsty. It would mean prey growing thinner, herbivores concentrating around fewer water sources, disease risk shifting, livestock becoming more exposed near shared resources, and the predator itself more likely to move outside its usual pattern in search of food or carrion. In a dry year, the cost of keeping one alive would spread beyond the reserve fence or park boundary. It would hit farmers, wildlife managers, road systems, emergency responders, and veterinary services all at once. The tyrannosaur would still be only one species. The bill would be distributed across many others. There is also the cost of time, which is often missed because it does not fit neatly into a budget line. Large, long-lived animals are commitments that outlast enthusiasm. Elephant best practice guidance includes geriatric care, because improved husbandry means animals live longer and develop new care burdens with age. A living T-Rex would almost certainly do the same if human care were good enough to keep one alive for decades. An old tyrannosaur would not simply become a quieter version of its younger self. It might require pain management, mobility support, modified feeding routines, more frequent scans, special flooring or substrate, and staff trained to recognize gradual decline in an animal nobody had ever before seen grow old. That is a financial problem, yes, but also a moral one. The longer lived the animal, the less honest it becomes to talk only about the thrill of acquiring it, and not about the decades of care that follow after the headlines have gone home. So when people ask what it would cost to keep one alive, the truthful answer is that the cost would not sit in one ledger. It would spread outward into prey management, land acquisition, public safety, disease surveillance, staff specialization, transport engineering, veterinary uncertainty, liability, and ecological side effects. A tyrannosaur in human care would be expensive in the straightforward way a giant dangerous animal is always expensive. A tyrannosaur in the wild would be expensive in the subtler way. A whole living system becomes expensive once society commits to keeping room for it. In either case, the price would be measured not only in money, but in land, attention, tolerance, and long-term institutional discipline. And once that becomes clear, the next question stops being whether we can afford the fascination. It becomes whether we should make room for the animal at all, and if we do, whether doing so is an act of wisdom, vanity, responsibility, or some uneasy combination of all three. By the time the bills, the land requirements, the veterinary uncertainty, and the prey demands were all laid out properly, the ethical question would stop sounding like a thrilling museum prompt and start sounding like public policy. A living Tyrannosaurus rex would not simply be an astonishing animal. It would be a claim on land, on money, on tolerance, on safety systems, and on the moral imagination of every society that shared space with it. That is when the conversation becomes harder and more useful. Because should it exist among us is not really a question about whether the animal is impressive enough to deserve a place. It is a question about what obligations follow once a dangerous species is real, ecologically meaningful, and impossible to reduce to harmless symbolism. The first ethical distinction is the most important one. If T-Rex had survived naturally into the present, then it would not be a luxury item of science or entertainment. It would be a living native species, and that matters. Conservation frameworks do not generally treat species as worthy only when they are convenient, attractive, or safe. The IUCN's reintroduction and conservation translocation guidelines are explicit that conservation action is justified by measurable benefit at the level of populations, species, or ecosystems, not merely by benefit to individual animals and certainly not by spectacle alone. In that light, a naturally surviving T. rex would begin with a strong presumption in favour of conservation. It would already belong to the living world. The burden would not be to prove it had a right to exist. The burden would fall on us to explain why inconvenience should count more heavily than extinction. That does not make the answer simple or sentimental. A species can have moral standing and still create very real harm. Human-wildlife conflict guidelines from IUCN exist precisely because coexistence is often difficult, costly, and emotionally charged. Those guidelines emphasise that such conflict is becoming more frequent, serious, and widespread, and that resolving it requires practical, context-sensitive, collaborative work rather than slogans. In a world with T-Rex, this would be impossible to ignore. Admiration from a distance would not pay for damaged livestock, lost access to land, disrupted transport, or the everyday stress of living near a huge predator. So the ethical case for allowing T-Rex to exist among us could never rest on wonder alone. It would have to include fairness to the people most affected by its presence. That point about fairness is where many romantic wildlife conversations become thin. The benefits of a charismatic apex predator are often spread widely across culture, science, and national prestige, while the burdens are concentrated locally. People far away get documentaries, museum exhibits, and the comforting feeling of supporting wild nature in principle. People nearby get fences to reinforce, movement restrictions to follow, and the occasional deeply unpleasant mourning. The IUCN conflict and coexistence material stresses the need for holistic and collaborative processes that take social, cultural, and economic context seriously. That principle would become central with T-Rex. A society could not honestly claim to value the animal while quietly asking rural communities to absorb the risk and expense without meaningful compensation, strong infrastructure, and a real voice in how coexistence is managed. There is also the ecological argument, and it is much stronger than people sometimes assume. Apex predators do not simply sit at the top of food webs as decorative threats. Recent work continues to show that apex predator biomass can strongly influence trophic associations, shaping prey populations and behaviour, and interacting with human disturbance in ways that matter for ecosystem stability. That does not mean every large predator produces a tidy textbook cascade in every landscape. Ecology is not that obedient, but it does mean that removing or suppressing a top predator can have consequences well beyond the animal itself. A living T-Rex would almost certainly do ecological work, not just occupy ecological space. It would alter prey behaviour, carcass availability, scavenger opportunities, habitat use, and perhaps even vegetation indirectly through fear and movement patterns. If those functions were real, then preserving the species would not be only about saving one dramatic lineage. It would also be about preserving a living ecological role. That creates a serious conservation argument in favour of its continued existence, but not an unlimited one. Ethical conservation is not the same as worship of predators. If a tyrannosaur population destabilised whole regions, drove repeated lethal conflict, or depended on constant emergency intervention to remain barely tolerable, then the moral picture would change. IUCN's reintroduction guidance emphasises feasibility, social acceptability, risk assessment, and resource availability alongside biological value. That logic applies here too, even though the species in this scenario is naturally extant rather than newly introduced. The right ethical standard would not be, save it no matter what happens to everyone else. It would be something more sober, protect the species if coexistence is genuinely workable, if the ecological benefits are real, and if the social costs are addressed honestly rather than outsourced to those with the least political power. Another tension would run through the entire debate. Is the goal to keep T-Rex alive as a wild animal, or to keep it available as a managed spectacle? Those are not the same thing. The moment institutions start justifying the species mainly through tourism revenue, national prestige or scientific fame, they risk turning a living predator into a public asset first and a wild organism second. That is ethically dangerous because it encourages a subtle kind of dishonesty. People begin speaking as though the species is protected for nature's sake while designing policy around human consumption of the experience. Conservation translocation principles are useful here because they insist on measurable conservation benefit, rather than benefit only to selected individuals or human excitement. Applied by analogy, that means the value of T-Rex should be judged by the health of the species and the ecosystems it shapes, not merely by how many visitors buy tickets to look at it from a reinforced platform. There is a second danger in the opposite direction. Fear can become its own kind of moral distortion. Large predator conflict is often magnified by visibility, symbolism, and dread, rather than by raw numbers alone. That does not make the fear foolish. A tyrannosaur would be dangerous in a very direct way, but a society that lets dread do all the thinking usually arrives at blunt tools very quickly. Blanket exclusion, reflexive lethal control, and politically satisfying zero risk promises often sound firm while failing ecologically or socially. The IUCN Coexistence framework exists precisely because simplistic responses rarely solve conflict for long. With T-Rex, a serious ethical approach would have to accept two things at once. The danger is real, and danger alone is not a sufficient moral argument for erasing a species from every landscape where it causes discomfort. The animal's own welfare would complicate matters further. If people decided they wanted T-Rex alive but only in heavily fortified, highly artificial conditions, there would come a point where protection looked suspiciously like custody. Keeping a few individuals alive in zoos or ultra-managed reserves might satisfy public fascination and preserve research access, but that would not automatically count as a good ethical outcome for the species. Conservation has long wrestled with the distinction between ex situ survival and genuinely functioning wild populations. A tyrannosaur held in permanent intensive management might be biologically alive and ethically diminished at the same time. The question would not be merely whether it could survive under our control, but whether a life spent inside human-designed limits still respected the animal as the kind of creature it was. At the same time, full wildness would not be ethically pure either. A wild T-Rex population would mean predation, stress on prey animals, injury, starvation during bad years, territorial fights, disease outbreaks, and difficult decisions when individuals repeatedly entered conflict zones. There is no clean version of nature here. Conservation ethics sometimes becomes confused when people compare living systems to moral ideals they were never designed to meet. Predators kill, prey suffer, carcasses rot, juveniles fail, adults age badly, disease moves through wildlife and livestock where their worlds overlap. WOAH's 2025 Wildlife Livestock Interface Guidance emphasizes that direct and indirect contact between wildlife and domestic animals can transmit pathogens both ways, and that reducing risk depends on mapping interfaces, identifying pathways, and changing management and infrastructure with strong stakeholder participation. So the ethical defense of a living T-Rex could never be that it represents some neat, harmonious nature. It would have to be that living systems are worth sustaining even when they are difficult, provided the harms are managed responsibly. That disease point matters more than it first appears. A tyrannosaur would not only be an endangered treasure or ecological force, it would also be a participant in the wildlife-livestock health interface, with all the management burdens that implies. Vocalizations guidance makes clear that the wildlife-livestock interface is a continuum, that risk assessment must look at species behaviour, farming systems, environmental conditions and human factors, and that mitigation depends on tailored local action plans and stakeholder acceptance. Ethically, that means the right to let T-Rex exist cannot be separated from the obligation to manage the health risks its existence creates. Romantic conservation that shrugs at disease transmission, farm losses or local mistrust is not morally superior. It is just outsourcing the difficult parts to someone else and calling the result principle. There is also a broader public value argument that would be hard to dismiss. A living T-Rex would be scientifically invaluable. It would transform paleontology, comparative anatomy, archosaur biology, biomechanics, sensory ecology, disease research, and conservation science all at once. That benefit would be real, but even here, caution is needed. Scientific value does not grant a blank check. Human history is full of cases where animals were treated as immensely valuable to knowledge and very poorly in practice. The moral case for allowing T-Rex to live among us cannot rest on what it teaches us alone. Knowledge may strengthen the argument for protection, but it cannot replace duties of welfare, habitat integrity, and fairness toward human communities. Otherwise, the species becomes a giant laboratory with teeth, which is not a conservation ethic. It is only a more educated form of possession. One of the strongest arguments in favour of coexistence would likely be a simple one. Extinction once chosen or accepted is final in a way discomfort is not. If T-Rex were naturally part of the present biosphere, eliminating it because it was large, costly, or politically inconvenient would amount to deciding that modern society deserves a monopoly on tolerable life forms. That is a very dangerous principle, because once accepted, it does not stop with tyrannosaurs. It reaches wolves, lions, crocodiles, sharks, bears, elephants, and eventually any species that asks too much room from us. The inclusion of human-wildlife conflict and coexistence under Target 4 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework reflects exactly this wider understanding. Species recovery and conservation are tied to actively managing human-wildlife interactions for coexistence, not simply removing wildlife whenever coexistence is hard. A living T-Rex would be the most dramatic possible test of whether we truly believe that principle. Still, principle on its own is not enough. A workable ethical position would need limits and conditions. It would need exclusion zones around dense settlements, compensation systems that actually paid on time, strict carcass and waste controls, disease surveillance, livestock protection, cross-border coordination, and a willingness to intervene against specific high-risk individuals without quietly turning that into a general war on the species. In other words, it would need coexistence as governance rather than coexistence as a slogan. The IUCN coexistence material repeatedly points toward practical guidance, context and collaboration, because those are the only forms of ethics that survive contact with real landscapes. If T-Rex existed among us, the moral standard would not be whether we felt awe in the abstract. It would be whether we were prepared to build institutions capable of handling awe's consequences. There is also a quieter point that would likely matter to many people, even if they never said it in policy language. A world with a living T-Rex would be hard to flatten into pure utility. It would insist every day that not everything large and real exists for our convenience. That does not make the animal sacred, and it does not erase the danger. But it does introduce a useful correction to modern habits of thought. We often behave as if the world is properly arranged only when every serious threat is contained, every edge is managed, and every species justifies itself in terms we find comfortable. A tyrannosaur would refuse that arrangement. To let it exist would be, in part, to accept that a mature civilization is not one that removes all difficult life from the map. It is one that learns when control is necessary, when distance is wise, and when room must be left for organisms that are not built to flatter us. That is philosophy, certainly, but it is also land management in less decorative clothing. So the answer, if one is honest, would probably be neither a cheerful yes nor an indignant no. If Tyrannosaurus rex were naturally alive today, it should exist among us in the sense that its extinction for our convenience would be a moral failure, but it should exist among us under a demanding social contract. Not as a pet, not as a theme park icon, not as a trophy of scientific power, and not as a predator whose costs are quietly pushed onto a few unlucky communities while everyone else applauds from safe regions. It should exist as a wild species whose ecological role is respected, whose conflicts are managed seriously, whose victims are not ignored, and whose survival is treated as part of the same biodiversity ethic we claim to support for every other dangerous, inconvenient, irreplaceable form of life. And once that conclusion settles in, the final part of the story becomes less about policy and more about perspective. Because living in a world that still made room for Tyrannosaurus rex would change not only how we governed land, but how we thought about the scale, age, and stubborn reality of the Earth itself. And so, after all this, after the roads and the fences, the carcass reports and the research permits, the emergency sirens and the field notes, the tracking collars and the parliamentary arguments, we arrive at a very ordinary and very strange picture. Not a world destroyed by Tyrannosaurus rex, and not a world that has somehow tamed it into a mascot, but a world that has had to adjust itself around the fact that one of the most famous animals in history never left. That is, I think, the part of this idea that lingers the longest. Not the teeth, though certainly those would linger in the mind with impressive efficiency. Not even the size, though size has a way of announcing itself rather forcefully. What lingers is the adjustment, the rearranging of expectations, the realization that modern life, for all its technology and schedules and systems and carefully painted parking lines, would still have to admit that there are places where a tyrannosaur may walk through before dawn and leave everyone else to sort out their confidence later. A living T-Rex would change the world in dramatic ways, yes, but it would also change it in quieter ways, the sort of ways that only become visible after years rather than headlines. It would change the shape of maps, it would change the design of roads, it would change the way children in certain regions learned about safety long before they learned algebra. It would change what people meant by wilderness. Right now, when many of us say a place is wild, we often mean that it is scenic, remote, and not too cluttered with human things. In a world with Tyrannosaurus rex, the meaning would sharpen. Wild would no longer just mean beautiful or distant. Wild would mean that the place still belonged in part to something that could not be reasoned with by committee. That would be an uncomfortable thought for many people, and probably a healthy one. Because for all our intelligence, humans have a curious habit of mistaking influence for ownership. We build, pave, fence, regulate, insure, and survey. And after doing all that for long enough, we start to feel that the world has been properly reduced to our scale. We become very impressed with our own diagrams. Then something arrives that refuses the diagram. Something too large for the gate, too old for the narrative, too biologically self-possessed to care what the planning office had in mind. A living T-Rex would be exactly that sort of correction. Not a fantasy correction, where everything collapses into screaming and chaos. A real correction. The sort that enters policies, habits, conversations and caution signs. The sort that makes people check the tree line more carefully before walking a dog at dusk. The sort that reminds a government minister that ecology does not end at a border crossing. The sort that forces a transport agency to accept that asphalt is not a magical surface upon which biology agrees to become reasonable. The sort that teaches a city that its outer green belt is not merely decorative if it also happens to be part of a predator corridor. And yet, for all that caution, I do not think the world would be smaller for having T-Rex in it. I think, in some important way, it would be larger, harder certainly, more expensive absolutely, less convenient in ways modern people would complain about with great energy and impressive repetition, but larger in the older sense, larger in wonder, larger in humility, larger in the number of living things that still exceeded our preferred limits. There is something narrowing about a world in which every truly enormous animal has either vanished or been pushed so far away from ordinary life that it becomes a logo, a memory, or a documentary category. We still have great creatures among us, of course. Whales, elephants, rhinos, crocodiles, big cats, bears, sharks. Even now the world is not empty of scale, but Tyrannosaurus rex belongs to a particular class of imagination. It is one of those animals that seems to stand with one foot in science and the other in myth. To have such a creature not in the fossil record alone but in the present tense would do something unusual to the human mind. It would keep alive the feeling that Earth has not finished surprising us. That may sound sentimental, but I do not mean it sentimentally. I mean it almost as a practical condition of thought. People behave differently when the world still contains forms of life they cannot easily shrink down into novelty or utility. Respect becomes less optional. So does patience. So does distance. You do not stroll carelessly through Tyrannosaur country with the relaxed confidence of someone browsing an outlet mall. You pay attention. You notice weather, tracks, silence, barriers, reports. You understand that the land is shared, though not equally, and certainly not always comfortably. Perhaps that would make some people kinder to the idea of limits. Modern life is not especially good at limits. We like access, immediacy, and the feeling that every path should be open if we simply want it badly enough. A living T-Rex would put an end to some of that attitude, at least in the regions where it still held range. There would be closures, restrictions, protected corridors, agricultural rules, emergency alerts, and inconvenient truths about where houses ought not to be built. Many people would resent this. Humans are wonderfully consistent about resenting whatever reminds them that the world does not owe them unrestricted movement at all times. But over generations, those limits might become normal. Children raised in such a world would not necessarily experience them as oppression. They might simply experience them as facts, the way coastal communities learn tides and mountain communities learn snow and desert communities learn heat. You do not argue philosophically with a floodplain at midnight. You respect it. Tyrannosaur country would likely become something similar. There is also the matter of time, which perhaps feels fitting after all. A living T-Rex would collapse certain distances in the human imagination. Not literal distances, unfortunately. Those would remain best kept as large as possible, but temporal ones. It is one thing to read that dinosaurs once dominated the land, and to see their bones laid out beneath careful museum lights. It is another to know that one of them, or rather one lineage of them, never stopped. That somewhere on the same planet as your supermarkets, commuter trains, tax forms and coffee shops, there still exists a descendant of those deep ages, not translated into a chicken, not softened into a sparrow, but preserved in giant predatory form. That knowledge would make history feel less finished. It might even alter the way we speak about extinction itself. Right now, extinct animals often sit in the mind as distant categories. Sad? Yes. Important? Yes. But fixed. Resolved by time. A living T-Rex would stand among us as proof that absence was not inevitable in every case, that some doors didn't close entirely, that the old world was not wholly old. And from there, it is not hard to imagine that people might feel the loss of other extinct species more sharply too. Once you live beside one survivor from a vanished age, the silence around those that did not survive may grow louder. Science, of course, would continue to benefit in ways almost impossible to overstate. But after everything we have considered, that no longer feels like the most interesting part. Yes, researchers would learn astonishing things. Yes, museums would be rewritten, textbooks revised, old assumptions discarded with varying levels of grace. Yet none of that is quite as striking as the wide social effect of simply having to live in the same age as the animal. Knowledge is one thing. presence is another. Presence has a way of altering not only what we know, but how we arrange our values around what is worth protecting, avoiding, studying, fearing and admiring. And I suspect admiration would remain, right to the end. Not simple admiration, not foolish admiration, not the sort that leans over barriers with a camera and learns a memorable lesson about judgment, but a more mature kind, the kind that can sit beside danger without trying to turn danger into a cuddly symbol. Humans are capable of this, at least sometimes. We admire mountains that can kill us, seas that can drown us, storms that can tear down what we build. We admire them not because they are safe, but because they are real on a scale that interrupts our usual self-importance. Tyrannosaurus rex would likely join that category. Not beloved in the manner of a pet, not welcomed into every conversation with comfort, but respected in the way one respects something that has remained powerfully itself for longer than our own species has had language. Of course, many would still want it gone. That too would be part of the world. There would be political movements, policy fights, furious editorials, difficult local meetings, and the very modern urge to simplify every complex question into two opposing teams wearing different colours. Some would say a creature this costly and this dangerous has no place in a civilized age. Others would insist that a civilization worth the name ought to be capable of making room for more than its own convenience. The argument would never fully disappear, and perhaps it should not. A society that stops arguing about how to live with difficult realities is often one that has quietly given up thinking. Still, over time, I imagine a certain steadier understanding would emerge. Not everyone would like Tyrannosaurus rex. Many would fear it, some with good reason. But even those who disliked it might eventually recognise that its continued existence said something about the world that was hard to dismiss. It said that Earth was not only ours to organise, it said that ancient lineages could still press against the edges of the modern order. It said that life, given enough time and enough room, does not always simplify itself for our convenience. That is not an easy message, but it may be a useful one, and perhaps, after enough years, people would learn to measure themselves against it in more thoughtful ways. Not by asking whether we could outrun it, which would be a very short and not especially dignified branch of public inquiry. Not by asking whether it made for excellent tourism revenue, though many would certainly try, but by asking whether we had become the kind of species that could manage power without erasing everything powerful around us. That seems to me the real test hidden inside this whole question. Because in the end, what if T-Rex were still alive today is not only a dinosaur question, it is also a human question. It asks how we respond when the world contains something magnificent that is not built for us, not answerable to us, and not especially interested in helping us feel secure. Do we make room for it? Do we study it honestly? Do we protect it while also protecting each other? Do we admit the cost without pretending the cost cancels the value? Do we accept that some forms of life are worth preserving, even when they make the map less neat and the budget less cheerful? I think those are good questions to sit with for a while. So now, as this long, quiet thought experiment begins to settle, picture it one last time, somewhere out there, not in a fossil hall and not behind the convenient fog of prehistory, but under a real night sky, in a real stretch of land shaped by rivers and shadows and wind, a Tyrannosaurus rex moves through the dark, not rushing, not performing, just going about the serious old business of being alive. Its feet find the ground with the confidence of something built for it. The air carries information we cannot smell. The trees hold still around it. Perhaps somewhere farther off, lights from a road or a distant town glow at the edge of its range, small and human and temporary looking by comparison. And maybe that is the final feeling such a world would leave us with. Not that humanity had become unimportant, but that we were not alone in being consequential. There would still be other claims on the earth, other lives scaled differently from our own, other presences old enough and large enough to keep our certainty from getting too comfortable. So let me ask you once more, gently, as we settle back into the ordinary world, or what passes for ordinary after a walk through all this. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your little corner of the world right now? Funny, really. We began with a dinosaur and ended with a way of looking at the land around us, the creatures within it, and the limits of our own control. And if this quiet journey through a world of living tyrannosaurs gave you something to think about, something to imagine, or simply a calm place to rest your mind for a while, I would be very grateful if you liked the video, maybe subscribed, and returned again for another slow wander through questions that are larger than they first appear. For now, though, let the image soften a little. Let the roads be still, let the fences hold, let the forests keep their secrets for the night. Somewhere in another version of the present, the old king of deep time still walks, and the modern world, however reluctantly, has learned to leave room for him,